What's up guys, Acerthorn here, and welcome to my Ideal Elder Scrolls 6 compilation. During this nearly 3-hour-long video, I will discuss what I want in the Ideal Elder Scrolls 6. I would also encourage you to post your ideas in the comments about what you would want in the Ideal Elder Scrolls 6. Do you agree with my vision? Do you have some minor tweaks you would like to make? Or do you think I'm completely full of crap and have no idea what the Elder Scrolls games are all about in the first place? Let's try to keep it civil, but I welcome you to disagree with me. This series was originally uploaded in 5 parts on the 5 Sundays of September 2018. I decided to make this video, consolidating the 5 parts into one single video for your viewing convenience. The description of this video will include a table of contents with timestamps you can click on to take you straight to the sections you are most interested in. Please remember that this is a consolidation of a mini-series, so during this video I will make references to past or future parts of this series, even though none exist. So keep that in mind while you watch the video. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Considering that this will likely be the first thing we experience in the game, it's fitting that I start with the introduction and tutorial quest. Much to, I'm sure, everyone's surprise, I would actually prefer it if Elder Scrolls 6 didn't even have a tutorial quest at all. Granted, the game needs a tutorial, but I would prefer if that tutorial were actually in a separate mode from the rest of the game. Take, for example, Splinter Cell Double Agent. In that game, protagonist Sam Fisher is supposed to be a seasoned veteran of Third Echelon, so forcing him into a tutorial mission at the beginning of the game would completely break the immersion. So, for those of you who are new to the franchise, the tutorial was actually available in a separate mode from the rest of the game and was completely optional. It took place in a white void, it was entirely fourth wall breaking, and it made no effort to tell a story of any kind. Its sole purpose was to teach new players the game mechanics. That's it. Why do I want a tutorial like this in the Elder Scrolls 6? Because that's the best way to adhere to Bethesda's mission with the Elder Scrolls franchise, which was to allow the player to create his own backstory with as few in-game restrictions as possible. In every Elder Scrolls game except Daggerfall, you always started out as a prisoner. This severely limits your role-playing ability. You are precluded from role-playing as A, a person with a clean criminal record, and B, a person who is actually from the province in which the game takes place. Even if you're playing as a race that is indigenous to that province, you specifically still have to be from outside of it. Granted, the games not only gloss over the details of why you were in prison, but also heavily imply that you shouldn't be in prison. In Oblivion, the Blades speculate that it was bureaucratic incompetence that landed you in that cell, while the Emperor suggests divine intervention. Meanwhile, in Skyrim, Hadvar says outright that you're not on the list of wanted men, but his commander is too lazy to sort out their errors. However, that seems more like Bethesda is just making excuses. Even if these explanations were not horribly contrived, the simple fact is that starting the player off in jail is getting repetitive, and it's time for you to try something new. So after you've completed the tutorial, if you even do so, you would start a new game, create your character's race, sex, and appearance, and then select an initial standing stone birth sign. You would, of course, have the option of changing the birth sign later on by visiting the appropriate standing stone, but I would like it if you were allowed to choose between all the standing stone blessings at the beginning of the game, instead of being restricted to only 3 blessings like in Skyrim. So after you have fully created your character and gave him or her an initial standing stone bonus, you would then wake up in a room at some inn in a starter town not unlike Seidonin or Riverwood, with a small amount of starter gear and about 100 gold in startup funds. There would be no introduction to the world. The player would just be dropped feet first into the thick of things, under the assumption that they already know the mechanics. I would prefer if this starter town was on the shores and was supported by a fishing industry. Why that location, you ask? Because that gives the player the freedom to decide for themselves whether they've lived in that town all their lives, or if they came to this town, whether they did so by land or by sea. The only thing about the player's backstory that would be decided for them is that they spent at least one night in this specific inn. Whether you lived in that town all your life, what possessed you to come to this location, what is driving you to leave that location, and where your family, if you even have any, is, would all be entirely at the player's discretion. The cutscene that would start the main quest could begin as soon as you step outside the inn. Ideally, I would like this cutscene to be portrayed as something that is beyond the character's control, something that the player character just happens to get caught up in the crossfire of. If the player is the chosen one of this main quest, I would prefer it if the player didn't know about his status as the chosen one until about 2 or 3 quests into the main quest line. Like in Skyrim, your first task of the main quest after exiting the starter town would be to bring news of the events to the local government head in the nearby big city, and on the road to that city you could come across some initial standing stones. So now that we've gotten the ideal introduction out of the way, let's move on to the game mechanics, shall we? After we've done the introduction, the first thing that any player needs to get familiar with is the controls. For the most part, I would recommend keeping Skyrim's control scheme. However, there is one minor tweak that I would like to see added, and that is a modifier button. It's basically like a control key on the keyboard. It causes other buttons to do something completely different if I'm holding down the modifier button. For example, on a keyboard, if I type the S key, the letter S will appear on screen. But if I hold down the control key and then press the S key, that will save my file for me. This effectively doubles the number of buttons you have at your disposal. I discovered the benefits of having a modifier button in gaming when I played WWE 2K18. Now, the WWE 2K series has had a modifier button for years now. It was mostly used to perform OMG moments by holding down the modifier, R1 by default, and then tapping the finisher button. However, it wasn't until WWE 2K18 that I realized the full potential of a modifier button in gaming. Nearly everything was slightly different if you had the modifier button held down. Climbing the turnbuckle normally had you facing the ring, but climbing the turnbuckle while holding the modifier button caused you to climb up with your back to the ring, putting you in a perfect position for a moonsault. Tap up on the D-pad when your opponent is down, and he'll slowly get back up. But if you tap up on the D-pad while holding the modifier button, he'll get to his feet with his back facing you, in the perfect position for a behind finisher like the skull-crushing finale. Now, how could that apply to the Elder Scrolls and Fallout games? Well, for starters, it allows you to have twice as many items favorited at a time, since the direction on the D-pad would select a different hotkeyed item depending on whether you had the modifier button held down. But even in gameplay, the modifier button could be a godsend. In Fallout 4 alone, I can't count the number of times I went to do a gun bash, but accidentally threw a grenade by mistake because I held down the button just a split second too long, or the number of times I went to throw a grenade only to do a gun bash. How many times have I went to reload my gun only to put it away by mistake? All of these instances could have been avoided if we just used a modifier button. Instead of tapping R1 to do a gun bash and holding R1 to throw a grenade, we could instead press R1 to do a gun bash and modifier plus R1 to throw a grenade. It would be a lot harder to try to do one thing and accidentally do another if the buttons you had to press were completely different. In the Elder Scrolls, the whole save, load, settings menu and the inventory, spellbook, map, character level menus have historically been in two separate menus that are activated by two separate buttons. But there's no reason it has to be that way. Instead, I would propose consolidating all 7 or 8 of these menus into a single pause menu. That would free a button up to be used for the modifier button. The first thing most casual fans think of when they think of the Elder Scrolls games is combat. In particular, how terrible, boring, and repetitive it is. Sadly, combat is not the Elder Scrolls franchise's strong suit, which is ironic considering that this franchise was originally intended to be a fighting game. However, I think Fallout 4 is when Bethesda really got it right with combat. So my ideal Elder Scrolls 6 will have a combat engine inspired by Fallout 4. First, in Skyrim, you got rid of the blade and blunt skills in favor of having one-handed and two-handed skills. When Skyrim first came out, I thought that was the best move, since blade and blunt always felt interchangeable to me, whereas one-handed and two-handed actually made a difference in gameplay, because wielding two-handed weapons meant you couldn't hold a shield. So when Skyrim came out, I thought to myself, good move. Separate the melee skills based on what the gameplay difference is, and then have skill perks provide further specialization into each type of weapon. However, after Fallout 4 came out, I think I would like to see a return to the blade and blunt skills. In Fallout 4, different enemies had different resistances to physical and energy damage, forcing the sole survivor to carry around at least 2 weapons, so he'd be prepared for whatever situation he might find himself in. I would like to see a system like that in the Elder Scrolls 6. Imagine if some scaly or hard-shelled enemies like Argonians and mudcrabs were resistant to bladed weapons, while bigger and bulkier enemies like giants and mammoths were resistant to blunt weapons due to their stronger bones and extra layers of cushiony muscle. Furthermore, imagine if light and heavy armor provided different levels of blade and blunt protection. Light armor like chainmail would be resistant to blade weapons, while heavy armor would be resistant to blunt weapons. Of course, heavy armor would still provide a small amount of blade resistance, and light armor would still provide a small amount of blunt resistance, so you wouldn't be completely defenseless. But you would never be fully optimized for anything the game might throw at you. This is in stark contrast to Skyrim, where you can temper your armor to provide the hard-coded maximum 80% damage reduction and 85% magic resistance, and you're basically an indestructible tank against anything the game could possibly throw at you. More importantly, optimizing your character in Skyrim is a simple matter of picking an armor style at the beginning of the game and sticking with it. There's very little reason to even touch the other armor style except just for the sake of saying you got 100 in every skill. But with my proposed system, you would be forced to switch between light and heavy armor almost on a dime. So this would be a great way of keeping the player on his toes and constantly vigilant of the world around him. Speaking of armor resistance, I would like to see Fallout 4's ratio-based armor system be included in Elder Scrolls 6. Like most other parts of Fallout 4's combat engine, this would not be something new for the Elder Scrolls, as Morrowind also had this system. Basically, the way it works is that damage is reduced based on a ratio of incoming damage to armor rating. So let's say you're dealing 10 damage with your puny pipe gun, and the raider has 20 armor rating. At a 2-to-1 armor to damage ratio, that means half of the damage from your gun will actually go through the armor, meaning that when it's all said and done, you only do 5 health. This seems like a nitpick, but this had an unexpected advantage when it came to making combat interesting and engaging. It meant that high speed but low base damage weapons like the minigun, which fired about 3,000 rounds per minute but only did base 8 damage per shot, were actually less effective against heavily armored enemies like Deathclaws. A lot of people criticized Bethesda giving us a minigun and a Deathclaw in the first hour of Fallout 4. But whether this was intentional or not, it actually highlighted the advantages of the ratio-based armor system. At 8 base damage and 500 rounds per magazine, a minigun should do a total of 4,000 base damage per magazine, which is more than 4 times the health the Deathclaw had. And yet, unless you were playing on the easiest difficulty, you could unload an entire magazine into the Deathclaw and it still wouldn't drop, because the ratio-based armor system meant that the higher burst damage, like with a Fat Man, was more effective against the heavily armored Deathclaw than mere DPS alone. If this were incorporated into the Elder Scrolls 6, it would force players to carry around both one-handed and two-handed weapons, so they would always be prepared for what may come. This means that a well-rounded character would have at least 4 weapons on him at any one time: a broadsword, a mace, a claymore, and a warhammer, as well as 2 sets of armor, light and heavy, in order to be prepared for whatever the game might throw at him. In addition to having the different damage types, I would like you to carry over Fallout 4's enemy system. Now obviously I don't mean I want Deathclaws in the Elder Scrolls. Rather, I mean that I want each enemy type to have some unique ability that makes fighting them a unique challenge compared to other enemy types. In Fallout 4, with the exception of radroaches, which were already the weakest enemy in the game, so it's excusable, every other enemy type had something unique about them. Human enemies like raiders and gunners would take cover behind barricades. Deathclaws would zigzag around to make them harder to shoot. Mirelurks had tough outer shells but vulnerable underbellies. Mole rats and rat scorpions could burrow underground and flank you. The list goes on and on. We need that in the Elder Scrolls 6. Each enemy should have some kind of unique ability. Figuring out the enemy's abilities and their patterns for using them would feel so rewarding, in an old school kind of way. Back in the 8 and 16-bit eras, actually memorizing a boss's pattern and adjusting your strategy accordingly was one of the most satisfying experiences ever. That satisfaction was recreated with Fallout 4, and that satisfaction could very easily be recreated with the Elder Scrolls 6. In addition, I would like you to incorporate Fallout 4's system of damage specific to a body part. Crippling a limb or inflicting an injury to the torso or head should have different effects that can make subsequent combat against that foe easier. There should also be weak spots on the enemy that you can target to inflict maximum damage. Up to this point, the Elder Scrolls has had enemies that only had one damage zone, their entire bodies. Combat should involve more skill and strategy than just hit him a bunch of times. You've done a splendid job of diversifying the damage in Fallout 4, so whatever you're doing there, just do that here. The last aspect of Fallout 4's combat engine that I would like to see in Elder Scrolls 6 is health restoration over time. Now, I don't mean Skyrim's system of restoring health over time. Some of your health regenerated naturally over time, and there were enchantments you could make to speed up that process even further. No, stop that. That broke the game and it sucked. But Fallout 4's Stimpak system was gold. It restored a percentage of your health rather than a flat number, but more importantly, it restored your health over time. So you still had to take cover and be strategic about your fighting. Similarly, I would like to see Elder Scrolls 6's health potions restore health over a period of time, preferably around 5 to 10 seconds, or perhaps even 30 seconds. Custom potions should also have a fixed duration, rather than restoring your health instantly. That about does it for the things I would like to see brought over from Fallout 4's combat engine. But before I move on to the next section, I would like to make a rather personal request. This has yet to be featured in any Elder Scrolls game or Fallout game, but if you could do it, I think it would be totally boss. Double team kill moves. Skyrim introduced the kill move, a quick cutscene that showed you doing a specific animation on your opponent that resulted in their death. This was an excellent addition, and it made killing enemies feel that much more rewarding. Well, imagine if you and your companion would do a kill move together. The possibilities are endless. If you're holding a blunt weapon and your companion is holding a bladed weapon, or vice versa, the blunt wielder could hit the opponent in the gut to make him bend over 90 degrees while the swordsman chopped off his head, execution style. A pair of swordsmen could take turns slashing the opponent to bits. A pair of mace wielders could sandwich an opponent's head in between two simultaneous mace blows. A pair of archers could put their backs to each other before shooting arrows simultaneously and symmetrically. The list goes on and on. From an immersion standpoint, that would create a strong bond and sense of camaraderie between you and your companions. And from a gameplay standpoint, it would encourage people to use different companions and to try different weapon combinations in order to see every double team kill move. So again, this is a very personal request. But then again, this is my ideal Elder Scrolls 6. If you could find a way to do it, I think it would be absolute boss. But of course, head-to-head combat is only one way to take out your foes. One of my personal favorite skill branches is stealth. I love stealth games. I love Splinter Cell, I love Assassin's Creed, and I loved Oblivion's Thieves Guild and Dark Brotherhood quest lines. For the most part, I would not want the stealth game mechanics to be too drastically overhauled. If it's not broke, don't fix it. However, there are a few minor tweaks I would like to see. As for pickpocketing, I would like to see a maximum pickpocket chance of 100%. Or at the very least, 99.99% chance. In vanilla Skyrim, pickpocketing just wasn't worth it because no matter how high your pickpocket skill was, you always had a 1 in 10 chance of getting caught. Master pickpockets should be able to always get away with pickpocketing if they're good enough at it. In fact, I wouldn't mind pickpocketing being turned into a skill-based minigame rather than a dice roll. In Oblivion and Skyrim, the player's skill-based lockpicking minigames were definitely superior to Morrowind's lockpicking mechanic of stab the chest with your lockpick as a weapon and just hope for the best. I believe a similar overhaul to pickpocketing could work in the franchise's favor to a similar degree. Imagine if the pickpocketing minigame were kind of like the old board game Operation. If you're too young to remember that board game, try playing the Nintendo DS game Trauma Center Under the Knife. I will provide a link to a Let's Play for that game so you can see how it works. you can probably see how a similar minigame for pickpocketing would be extremely immersive for the Elder Scrolls games. Speaking of immersion for stealthy players, I would like it if you fleshed out the sewers a bit. Sewers are a go-to place for outlaws to hang out without fear of being arrested on sight by guards, so I would like it if you had more intricate sewer systems for the player to use as his unofficial abode. Now, in Oblivion, the Imperial City had a great sewer system for outlaws to hang out in. Manholes were found in the basements of most buildings in the Imperial City, allowing you to slip into a home or shop whenever I wanted to rob it, and slip away without ever being seen in the public streets. However, even in Oblivion, the Imperial City was the only city in the game with such an intricate sewer system. Meanwhile, Skyrim did away with the sewer system completely, except for Riften, and even within Riften it couldn't be used to covertly break into homes in order to roleplay as a thief. I would like to see the sewer system from the Imperial City not only return, but expanded upon. Every city in the game should have a sewer system for outlaws to hide out when they have a bounty. Every building in those cities should have manholes in their basements to allow me to covertly break into their homes without risking being seen on the streets, and every city should have its sewer system be deposited into a nearby river or lake, allowing secret entrance into the city without having to go through the main gate. If you have an active bounty, or if you're a vampire, making optimal use of these sewers would be a great way to feel immersed as an unwanted outcast of society. For my last request in the stealth section, I would like there to be more objects for stealthy players. For example, if you could find a lore-friendly way to have smoke bombs or something that does a similar effect, I would like to see them in Elder Scrolls 6. Flashbangs would also be great to have, if you could find a way to make them lore-friendly. Give me the ability to put out candles and other light sources using some sort of water or magical darkness effect. This is, admittedly, one of the least important things that I will talk about in this 5-part mini-series, but I nevertheless will mention it. After all, this is my ideal Elder Scrolls 6. I will spare no expense. So I've covered how I want the combat engine to be overhauled, and I've covered what I want to keep and what to change about the stealth system. What about being a mage? Well, I want to see a return to custom spells, but I will discuss that in detail next episode when I talk about crafting. For the time being, however, I would like to discuss how magic should work more generally. Skyrim did away with custom spell making, but the spells you could find in the game were still a lot more fun than the default spells in Morrowind or Oblivion. For example, fireball spells had a tendency to explode in fiery bursts and do area of effect damage, shock spells could leap from one enemy to the next, fire spells do lingering damage, frost spells would slow enemies down and, at higher levels, freeze them solid. Shock damage also damages the target's magicka, making them a preferred spell when battling mages. Rune spells can be cast on the ground and explode like landmines, while wall spells, despite their name, are actually cast on the ground rather than a wall, but when an enemy walks over them, it does 5 times as much damage per second as simply casting the spell directly at them. This is something I would like to see kept in Elder Scrolls 6. In Morrowind and Oblivion, there was practically no reason to use default spells. Your only reason to get them was to learn their spell effects so you could make your own, more potent custom spells. But if the default spells had unique properties, we would have an incentive to use them over our own custom spells. However, one problem in Skyrim that I would like to see rectified is that destruction spells are way too expensive. Let me give you a breakdown. Suppose you've leveled up to level 21. Let's assume the best case scenario here, so let's assume that every time you level up, you take extra magicka so as to max out your magicka pool. That means you would have a total of 300 magicka, or 350 for high elves. Let's say you've got 50 destruction skill, which is reasonable by the time you're at level 21, so you've just taken the Adept Destruction perk, which reduces the magicka cost of Adept level destruction spells by half. This means that the Fireball spell now costs 49 magicka to cast. However, with 300 magicka, that means you can only cast 6 fireballs before you've completely depleted your magicka reserves, and High Elves can only cast 7. Skyrim's destruction school seems to be balanced around the assumption that you're going to use enchanted clothing or armor to reduce the magicka cost of your spells. We'll get into enchanting next time, but right now, suffice it to say that enchanting should only be a bonus. It should not be required to play the game normally. In addition, there were a few spell effects that were removed from Morrowind to Oblivion, and a few that were removed from Oblivion to Skyrim, and I would like to see a few of them make a comeback. One spell effect that is on the top of my wish list is levitation. Now, I understand why you took out levitation. In Morrowind, most of the cities existed as part of the overworld. No open cities mod was necessary. The only exception to that was Vivec, and it had a ceiling over it, so you were already prevented from just levitating your way in there. However, in Oblivion and Skyrim, major cities were in a different cell than the overworld. If you didn't go through the main gate and its load screen, you would fall into some unrendered nether space. So levitation had to go to prevent gamers from doing that. However, in Fallout 4, you can use the jetpack in your own power armor to leap over the walls of Good Neighbor without having to go through the main gate. If you did that, you would still get the load screen the same as if you had gone through the main gate, and you would appear just inside the main gate. So, now that you've figured out how to trigger the load screen even if the player uses levitation to go over the city walls, I would like levitation to make a comeback, since there's no reason not to have it. In addition, I would like to see a return to Oblivion's and Morrowind's conjuration schools. Being able to summon only 4 types of Daedra in Skyrim is awful. And only being able to reanimate corpses instead of summon skeletons, zombies, and ghosts out of nowhere certainly didn't give the Conjuration School enough variety. I like Skyrim's system of being able to have multiple summons at one time, but what's the point of having multiple summons if they're all the same? Variety is the spice of life after all. I would also like to see the return of Night Eye and Open spells. Technically, Skyrim had Night Eye and Open spells, but they were few and far between. Night Eye was only available to Khajiit and vampires, while Open spells were only available as a greater power if you took the Tower Standing Stone, which nobody ever took. Speaking of Open, I would also like to see Morrowind's Lock spell return. It was included in Oblivion's game file, but isn't used by any spell that is accessible through normal gameplay, and I would very much like to see it return in Elder Scrolls 6. It would be a great way of keeping your family and servants out of your personal belongings chest, as well as role-playing as a thief by covering your tracks by relocking the doors to make it seem as if you were never there to begin with. I would also like to see a return of Morrowind's Blind and Sound spell effects to augment my stealth, as well as Mark and Recall and the various intervention spells, for those of us who want to get around quickly but find fast travel to be immersion breaking. However, I am quite happy with Chameleon staying retired, as I always found that spell to be completely useless with any magnitude below 100%, and completely game-breaking and OP if the magnitude was 100%. I am quite happy with how invisibility has the balance of being negated whenever you do things. If you're going to bring it back, it should, at the very least, not be eligible for enchanting your clothes and armor. Well, you've probably heard this a million times already, but first and foremost, I want to see a return to the ability to make custom spells. The ability to make custom spells was a huge boon to role-playing as a mage. In fact, it was practically necessary to play Oblivion on the highest difficulty, as I am currently demonstrating in my current Let's Play of Oblivion on max difficulty. If you're interested, you can find the playlist for that Let's Play by clicking on the card that I provide right here. Now granted, custom spells had the potential to become OP. For example, a high magnitude but low duration charm spell can completely trivialize the game's persuasion system. Granted, Oblivion's persuasion system was a total dumpster fire, but it's the principle of the thing. A single second paralysis spell can give you a huge advantage over your foes, even if it's only for a single second, and in Morrowind, adding in a Drain Intelligence 100 points for 1 second on stealth effect on any spell would instantly refill your magicka, completely eliminating the biggest drawback of the Atronach birth sign at a minimal cost. However, this can be balanced by requiring the duration of certain effects to be in set increments. Spells that have a magnitude would require durations that are multiples of 30 seconds, while spells that don't have a magnitude, like paralysis, would require durations that are multiples of 5 or 10 seconds. This would prevent players from simply having OP spell combinations that require little magicka to cast, but can bypass entire game mechanics in one fell swoop. Next, let's discuss... Put in the simplest terms, I want it nerfed. It was way too overpowered in Skyrim. In Skyrim, the ability to equip up to 4 items at a time that fortified your skills by 25 points each effectively nullified the need to train any of your skills naturally. So I used to be an axe-swinging orc warrior. Well, with enchanting, a single set of enchanted gear that I can simply equip and unequip at will instantly make me into the sneakiest of sneaky thieves, or a mage who can spam the most powerful spells in existence. If I want to be a jack of all trades, I should have to work my butt off to get that far. It would feel more rewarding if I were forced to earn my skill ups. But even setting that aside, Skyrim's enchanting system completely negates the incentive to go out into the world and do quests. The whole point of the Elder Scrolls games is to go out questing and adventuring. To incentivize the player to do this, unique artifacts are usually offered as rewards for these quests, but in Skyrim, by pumping enough into your enchanting, you can create the most powerful weapons and armor without leaving the comfort of your own home. Take Chillrend, for example. That is a weapon that was featured in both Skyrim and Oblivion. In Oblivion, however, the weapon is much more valuable because you can't simply make the same thing at an enchanting altar. The most powerful version of this sword had 4160 enchantment points packed into it, whereas the most enchantment points in Oblivion you could pack into a custom enchantment was 1600. Meaning that if you wanted to enchant a glass short sword with a frost damage weakness to frost combination, you would have to either have a weaker effect on the enchantment or have fewer charges before the object needed recharging. In Oblivion, Chillrend was actually a worthwhile artifact to acquire. But in Skyrim, the number of enchantment points that a Grand Soul provides to an enchanted weapon is 3,000. Now at first glance that seems fine, but then the highest quality version of Chillrend you can acquire also has 3,000 enchantment points. However, why would I bother with Chillrend's puny 30 points of frost damage when I could just make a custom enchantment that does 3 times as much frost damage has a chance to paralyze the target for twice as long as Chill Rend, and then just use Fortify Destruction and Fortify Alteration enchantments to get unlimited charges out of that more powerful item. Sure, I can use those same enchantments to get unlimited charges out of Chill Rend, but if a weapon has unlimited charges, then I'm naturally going to go with the weapon that has the higher base damage, which is my custom creation. And don't even get me started on the Daedric artifacts. So Volendrung is a warhammer bequeathed to me by the Daedric Prince Malakath. This item should be a weapon of godly power. In Oblivion, it was indeed such a weapon, as it was the only guaranteed instance in the game of a weapon with a paralysis enchantment. Only 2 other weapons in the game had a paralysis enchantment, and they were both available only from random loot. Since you couldn't make custom paralysis enchantments, getting a weapon with paralysis already on it was a big deal. But in Skyrim, Volendrug merely absorbs the target's stamina. It doesn't even so much as have a second enchantment on it, so why would I even bother with this piece of trash warhammer? So yeah, long story short, Enchanting in Skyrim is OP, please nerf. But just how exactly should it be nerfed? Well, for starters, make it weaker. Oblivion's system of enchanting was suitably balanced. Attribute and skill fortifications were capped at 10 points for each custom enchantment. I would prefer if we stuck to that system. However, please keep Skyrim's ability to enchant items for free, minus the cost of the soul gem itself. The ability to enchant for profit is a great way to roleplay as a normal, non-adventuring citizen if that's your thing. Also, fortifying your magic skills should not reduce the cost of casting the spells. As I mentioned last time, the spells should already be cheap enough to cast consistently. Instead, magic skill fortifications should increase the potency of your spells, rather than simply making them easier to cast. In addition, I would also like the ability to create enchantments much faster than in Skyrim. With Skyrim's Alchemy, if I have a stack of ingredients I can mix together, I can simply spam the F key to make plenty of potions very quickly until I run out of one of the ingredients. Same with smithing. I can continue to spam the Enter key to make hundreds of iron daggers to power level my smithing skill in minutes. However, enchanting large batches of items is a tedious process in Skyrim, mostly because the item, effect, and soul gem are reset after each enchantment. If I have a stack of iron daggers and a stack of filled petty soul gems, I should be able to simply spam the F key to create dozens, if not hundreds, of banish enchantments in only a few minutes, until I either run out of daggers or run out of soul gems, whichever occurs first. Last but not least, I would like to see the ability to enchant weapons with unlimited charges, but in exchange, the effects would be much weaker than if I had charges on them. For example, in Morrowind, enchanted clothing and armor had the potential to simply act as a temporary spell with durations that were simply cast whenever you equipped the item. In fact, most enchanted apparel that wasn't your own custom creation was like that. However, if you had a grand soul, you could enchant a piece of apparel with a constant effect enchantment, which is the standard in Oblivion and Skyrim, but at the cost of it being much weaker than what you would get by having be cast unequip. In Elder Scrolls 6, I would like to see that option for weapon enchantments. That about does it for enchanting, so let's move on to... For the most part, Skyrim's alchemy system was practically perfect. I love the way you can discover every effect on every alchemy ingredient as early as level 1 by mixing the right ingredients together. I also love how you can learn alchemy effects by eating ingredients straight, but this can only be used to learn every alchemy effect after you've unlocked the right perks. So it's nice and balanced. This is a huge improvement from Oblivion's alchemy system, where you learn new alchemy effects quite arbitrarily simply by increasing your alchemy skill. However, I would like to see a return to Morrowind's and Oblivion's different levels of alchemy gear. The ability to create stronger potions if you have stronger gear, as well as higher level, was a huge boon to roleplaying. While I would not recommend getting rid of the alchemy station, the ability to make new potions in the field just seemed way too OP for my taste. I would prefer if these stronger alchemy gear were instead upgrades you could apply to the alchemy table. Upgrades to your alchemy table could be valuable dungeon loot or expensive items to purchase. I would also like to see Oblivion's Master Alchemy perk return. The ability to create potions using a single alchemy ingredient. It should be a perk you should have to unlock with a perk point, but it should still be there. In addition, I would like the ability to brew potions in batches. I could tap the F key, X button on Xbox or square button on PlayStation to make a single potion. But imagine if I hold down the modifier button, see last episode for more details, and I could make as many potions as I had ingredients selected, and get the experience for all of them individually. This would significantly cut down on the time spent brewing potions. In addition to streamlining the potion process, I would also like to see a return of Oblivion's and Morrowind's ability to rename my potions. This gives me the ability to personalize my potions, and I have no effing idea why you took it out of Skyrim. Like, seriously, what were you hoping to accomplish by doing that? You kept the ability to rename our own custom enchantments, so why did you take out the ability to rename our potions? Last but not least, I would like the ability to adjust the strength of our potions. We can adjust the strength of our weapon enchantments, so why not give us the ability to adjust the strength of our potions? I mean, I can't think of a reason not to give us that option. The keyword being option. Of course, the potion strengths would be set to maximum by default, but as long as adjusting the potion strength is 100% optional, is there any reason not to put it in? Skyrim was the first time you had attempted smithing in an Elder Scrolls game, and suffice it to say, it was a complete dumpster fire. While the idea of being able to create your own weapons and armor out of raw materials is an incredible idea on paper, the execution could not have been more lacking. Where do I even begin? For starters, it was almost impossible to level smithing up to 100 without spamming hundreds more weapons and armor than you would ever use yourself. Initially, you needed approximately 300 weapons regardless of value to get to 100 smithing, but a patch was installed, I forget which one, that caused the smithing experience to be based on the value of the item being crafted. So you need more than 2,000 iron daggers to get up to level 100 smithing. Honestly, I would have preferred it if it stayed at 300 iron daggers to get up to 100, because at least then it would have corresponded to the number of enchantments you needed to make raising enchanting to the same level. Tempering your weapons and armor at the workbench was also a means of leveling your smithing skill, but not a financially viable one. Let's take iron daggers for instance. At level 15 smithing, I can temper an iron dagger at a grindstone to increase its monetary value by 1 septim. However, to do so, I need an iron ingot, supposedly to compensate for the iron shavings that I'm shaving off. This iron ingot, however, is worth 7 septims, so I actually operate on a net loss when improving the quality of this dagger. The only way I can turn a profit from tempering the weapons and armor is if I'm already at a high enough level of smithing, and at that point in the game, I've probably got so much money that it doesn't matter anyway. So you can't even use smithing to roleplay as a blacksmithing merchant. Long story short, the only way to make smithing a viable skill is if I treat it as my profession, and that requires focusing attention away from the dungeons and quests out there begging to be explored, which would defeat the whole purpose of leveling smithing up in the first place. 90% of the problems with smithing and how it is leveled can be fixed with a simple tweak. When you find a weapon or piece of armor out in the world, or after you craft a weapon or piece of armor at a forge, that weapon or armor is currently at base quality. It has yet to be improved at the grindstone or workbench. Tempering it at the workbench or grindstone would give it an improvement. However, in Skyrim, this improvement is permanent. You can improve it again after you level up your smithing skill to the point where tempering it a second time would actually make a difference, but the improvement never actually goes away. That last bit is the part that needs to be tweaked. The level of improvement that a weapon or armor has should go down with each hit, much like charges on an enchanted weapon. However, like charges on an enchanted weapon, the weapon or armor should never go below base quality. This simple tweak would require frequent trips to the smithy in between dungeon sessions in order to keep your gear in top shape, giving you frequent opportunities to level your smithing skill without having to spam new weapons and armor that you'll never actually use. However, unlike the armorer skill of old, the fact that the weapons and armor never go below base quality would not cripple those who wished to forego the skill entirely. This would allow for slow but regular skill increases, so you would reach 100 smithing about the same time as you reached 100 in your other primary skills, no spamming or grinding necessary. Of course, that won't eliminate all the problems that smithing has. Another huge problem with the execution of the smithing skill is that the materials to make the most powerful gear were simply too easy to come by. At high enough levels, you could buy more than 20 ebony ingots at one time from a blacksmith merchant. Surprisingly, the most annoying ingots to come by in Skyrim were a refined moonstone, used to create elven armor and weapons, which were only middle tier. Granted, at least in Skyrim, the ebony and malachite mines were mostly on the eastern border, closer to Morrowind, so at least it was lore-friendly that those mines existed, although that doesn't justify why blacksmith merchants could sell 24 ebony or malachite ingots at one time. In Elder Scrolls 6, I would like to see malachite and ebony be extremely rare. Creating the best gear should be a rewarding experience, and that means that at least one of the ingredients needed to craft it should be extremely hard to come by. Heck, I wouldn't mind it if there were only about 50 to 100 ebony or malachite ingots in the entire game non-respawning. It would force you to plan ahead and be strategic with your gear. And finally acquiring this gear would feel like you've reached a real milestone. In addition to the rarity of the ingredients, I would also like it if you had to learn a recipe in order to be able to smith the highest tier items like Daedric, Dragonbone, and Dragon Scale. Skyrim's smithing skill allows you to instantly know how to craft these items simply by unlocking a perk. There should be an in-universe way to acquire the knowledge of how to smith these things. By going on the quest to retrieve the schematics for the Daedric weapons and armor, or the dragon weapons and armor, we can feel rewarded when we finally acquire the items. Take The Witcher 3 as a primary example. You have to find a diagram of the best gear in the game before you can hire a blacksmith to forge it for you. A similar system would be a good idea in the Elder Scrolls 6. In fact, I would like it if you required us to learn the recipes and go on quests to acquire the recipes for middle tier weapons and armor as well, although these quests would be much easier than those for the top tier recipes. Only iron, steel, leather, and whatever light armor is worse than leather, whether it be hide, fur, or something else entirely, should be the only materials you can smith with at the start of the game. But middle and upper tier weapons and armor should require quests, not merely skill perks, to unlock. Last but not least, I would greatly appreciate the ability to customize my own weapons and armor through the use of in-game palette swaps. Wrestling games have been using this feature since before the 21st century, and it's a great way to give your character a unique look without requiring the players to become college-trained graphics designers. For example, notice these trunks. They were supposed to look like military camouflage, but by using the in-game palette swaps, I was able to make them look like something else entirely. Giving us the ability to palette swap our weapons and armor would be a great way to give us the ability to personalize our stuff. So that about does it for the ways you can craft items. But there's another means of making money in the Elder Scrolls games. You can always try to make a career out of things that are not entirely legal. First and foremost, crime has to be a very lucrative means of making money. I doubt anybody in-universe would resort to a life of crime if they could make a fortune through purely legitimate means like alchemy or enchanting. Wealthy homes should be filled to the brim with jewelry, paintings, sculptures, clothes, and silver cutlery ripe for the taking. Their food barrels should also be filled with expensive food items, and their weapons, armor, and clothing should mostly be enchanted. The value-to-weight ratios for the stealable items in the wealthiest homes should be no less than 100 to 1. To offset this high value, I would recommend making these houses incredibly hard to break into. Their doors should have master-level locks, and their servants should have a night shift of servants who patrol the house at night with enchanted weapons and armor while their daytime servants are asleep. I will go into further detail in part 4 of this discussion. Now, if you get arrested, I would greatly appreciate the opportunity to plead your case, either by bringing back Daggerfall's court system or by being able to plead your case to a guard while being arrested. If you want to use the latter, you could give the player a dialogue option of, "Sorry, it was an accident," which would be a check against your speech skill, but the speech skill needed to clear your name should be dependent on a variety of other circumstances. For example, if there's a dragon or vampire attack when you commit an assault or murder, the assault or murder should be easier for a guard to forgive since the circumstances surrounding it lend plausibility to your friendly fire being accidental. Dark Brotherhood assassins could use the carnage of a dragon or vampire attack as cover to murder their targets in broad daylight and then plead accident if they have enough speech skill. Likewise, if you open up the lockpicking minigame on a door or chest, but don't gain any lockpicking experience, meaning that you neither picked the lock nor broke any of your lockpicks, the game engine would act under the assumption that you exited out of the lockpicking minigame immediately after entering it, and therefore make it easier for you to plead that the trespass was an accident. The disposition needed to convince a guard that it was an accident should also be reduced if you're a Thane of that city, or whatever you call the equivalent rank in Elder Scrolls 6. I highly doubt you're going to call it a Thane. However, the speech threshold should be increased if the victim of your crime was a nobleman or government official. The speech threshold should be lowered if the guard's disposition is high towards you, and increased if the guard's disposition is low. We'll talk more about that next week when we discuss NPCs and their social interactions. But the speech threshold should also increase if you commit multiple crimes in quick succession, and should increase at an exponential rate. For example, breaking into someone's home and subsequently stealing something should be exponentially more difficult to plead accident towards than either of those two crimes by themselves. Also, you should be permanently banned from a good faction like the Fighters Guild if you rack up a lifetime bounty too high. It makes sense in-universe that the guilds would not want you associated with them if you give the faction a bad rep. If you plan on keeping the bounties the same as in Oblivion and Skyrim, where a murder gets you 1,000 gold bounty and an assault gets you a 40 gold bounty, and so on, then I would recommend you being permanently banned from a good faction upon acquiring a bounty of 10,000 gold or 10 murders. This would encourage players to act with discretion while engaging in illegal activities. It would also allow you to play the evil factions and good factions in one playthrough, while still allowing for some realism and immersion by having the factions throw you out if they have some means of proving that you're giving them a bad name. The key word being have some means of proving. That almost does it for crime in The Elder Scrolls 6, but before we end the episode, I need to address one of the most controversial game mechanics in the Elder Scrolls games. We've all had this discussion a million times before, so I won't beat a dead horse. I understand why Bethesda made essential NPCs unkillable. With the addition of Radiant AI in Oblivion, the possibility exists that NPCs may meet an untimely demise in the player's absence when the player has no means of knowing about the danger or protecting them. In the words of YouTuber Sorcerer Dave, formerly known as Jingles, the whole argument for making all NPCs mortal in the first place is that doing away with them would be solely at the player's discretion. But in a more modern Elder Scrolls game, that simply wouldn't be the case. However, while that may have given Bethesda an excuse in Oblivion, I cannot in any way forgive them for executing the concept even worse in Skyrim. Many of the essential NPCs didn't even need to be essential. The quests they were part of didn't seem that important anyway, although I realize that's subjective. But you know what isn't subjective? These NPCs would keep their essential status even after their quests were completed. There is literally no good reason whatsoever to keep them essential at that point. Maybe you had an excuse in Oblivion. Maybe the inclusion of unkillable quest characters was a last-minute addition that you realized was necessary only at the last possible minute while you were playtesting the Radiant AI in the final months before going gold. But you've had 2 games to get your act together, Bethesda. You're out of excuses, and it's time for the fanbase to stop giving you a free pass. Skyrim is even less of an excuse because the game introduced what should be the perfect compromise: protected NPCs. The protected status means that the game cannot kill the NPCs, but the player can strike them down without issue. So why shouldn't that be the default means of ensuring that quest characters don't die outside the player's control? You literally created the perfect solution to this problem, and then made the conscious choice not to implement it. I mean, I would say you're out of excuses not to have killable NPCs in Elder Scrolls 6, but frankly, you ran out of excuses in Skyrim when you already had the best solution to this problem only to not use it. So, I want essential NPCs gone for good in Elder Scrolls 6. Replaced entirely with protected ones. Got it? I would also like to see royal people protected, not by all-powerful game mechanics, but by having a buttload of in-universe protections. They should have an entire team of bodyguards instead of a single bodyguard. Many noblemen and their super wealthy private citizens can have only a single bodyguard each, but royalty should have a small army protecting them. These royal bodyguards should be an extremely high level and should be decked out in some of the best gear in the game. Like, seriously, leather armor and a puny steel sword for the person who protects the Jarl of Whiterun? Surely the Jarl can do better than that. Give that chick some glass armor and weapons, and enchant that shit while you're at it. In addition to a chief royal bodyguard, the royalty should also have a minimum of 8 deputy bodyguards, with half of them protecting the royalty in the daytime and half at night while the daytime shift is asleep. In addition to having fully juiced out bodyguards protecting the royalty, they should also be protected by enforcing a minimum distance from them. If you enter the royal building, the interior of that building should be divided into 3 invisible zones. In the green zone, the one nearest the front door, the guards will warn you to sheath your weapon if you have it out, but will not attack you. In the yellow zone, the guards will not attack you as long as you have your weapon sheathed, but will attack immediately if you draw your weapon. Meanwhile, the red zone, which includes the radius around the throne as well as the entirety of the royalty's personal living area, is entirely off limits, with or without your weapon drawn. This would make it astronomically difficult to actually assassinate anyone who is royal. In fact, you should have an achievement out of that. If you manage to assassinate a head of state and successfully flee the city with your life intact, that should be so difficult that it should grant you an in-game achievement or trophy as a result. Morrowind did not have companions at all. Oblivion had companions that were fairly useless, seeing as they were only available at the end of quest lines and seemed to enjoy throwing themselves into death traps and dying on the first enemy after you recruit them. Skyrim had followers that couldn't die in combat unless you killed them, but literally everything else about them sucked donkey butt. About a year after Skyrim was released, 99% of Skyrim players would have either Faendal or Lydia as their companion. You know why? Because those were the companions you could acquire very early in the game, and that was honestly as good as you were going to get. Even though you had about 100 different NPCs in the game you could choose from, there was no incentive to have different companions because they were literally all the same. Followers in Skyrim are about as bland and interchangeable as they come. All the housecarls have the exact same lines of dialogue. Literally the exact same lines. All of them have no backstory. They don't even appear in the game until they're appointed to your service, and no personality whatsoever. The hirelings are much the same way. They'll fight by your side if you pay them 500 gold, and that's the extent of their character. The one-off followers aren't much better either. Koznak and Markarth will be your follower if you give him a beer. So he's a drunk. That's it. That's his character. Benor of Morthal and Uthgerd the Unbroken of Whiterun both love to brawl, and there's really nothing to them except that. Faendal and Sven are involved in a quasi-sorta interesting love triangle that you can resolve in 2 minutes flat. When that's done, their interestingness comes to a screeching halt. Sure, there are some followers out there with personalities, such as Mill the Lioness, a selfless retired adventuress with a heart of gold who will reminisce about her past adventures when you enter places. Serana, a vampire with a psychopath dad and an overprotective mom who was locked in solitary confinement for about 1,000 years, while somehow maintaining her sanity. Jizargo, an overcompetitive cat wizard who spent years searching for the right magic school so he could concentrate on his work without worrying about politics. Cicero, an assassin who spent only a few years in solitary confinement, but failed where Serana had succeeded and actually went batshit insane. However, these instances are few and far between. Most of the followers in the game, excluding user-created mods, could just as easily have been pumped out by a make-your-own-follower machine added by a user mod. The biggest sin in all of this is the followers need personalities more than anyone else. They're the people you're going to be spending the most time with, the ones you will be getting to know most intimately, not necessarily in the romantic sense. They're the ones who need the most depth. Now, Bethesda did a commendable job of correcting this in Fallout 4. They realized that the fans wanted quality over quantity in our companions. Fallout 4's companions were clearly more fleshed out than Skyrim's followers. They had their flaws and their strengths, their quirks and their idiosyncrasies, also their affinity system, which went from a range of -500 to +1000, was a much better system for gauging how much your companions liked you or didn't like you than Skyrim's disposition system was. Meanwhile, if you asked the companion for their thoughts, those thoughts would change depending on what their current affinity towards you was. So I am in high spirits that you'll carry that over to Elder Scrolls 6. However, one thing about Fallout 4's companions that I was hoping you could improve upon is how their character arcs were handled. Kate is an example of a companion in Fallout 4 who had a clear character arc. She started out not trusting you, expecting you to just use her as cannon fodder. But she slowly starts to warm up to you until she entrusts you with helping her cure her chem addiction. You did a stand-up job of showing a change in her personality after this character arc, as she would lose affinity for you if she saw you taking chems, whereas previously that caused her affinity to increase. By contrast, Preston Garvey is a shining example of the complete opposite of how to do a character arc. After you reach 1,000 affinity with Preston, he confides in you that he was suicidal when you first met him, but his friendship with you restored his will to live, spelling out for me in dialogue what his character arc was, because I couldn't make heads or tails of it from his actions in-game. Preston's character arc violates one of the most basic rules of writing: show, don't tell. Jerry Jenkins, co-author of the Left Behind series, and having sold more than 70 million books across 190 different publications, has a website where he gives advice to aspiring authors. On this webpage, which I will be providing a link for in the description, he emphasizes the importance of showing rather than telling. Let me give you an example that you can probably relate to even if you don't do a lot of reading for entertainment. Hermione Granger is a brainiac. We all know she's a brainiac, that's her most defining character trait. But let me ask you, at what point in any of the 7 books does J.K. Rowling ever explicitly state outright that Hermione is a brainiac? You'd be shocked to hear that the books actually never tell us that. Instead, we know what that's Hermione's primary character trait because of what we read about her doing. She's always the first to raise her hand to offer answers to teachers' questions. She's always the first to go to the library. She's always the one who figures out the missing links in the mysteries they need to solve. So the Harry Potter books demonstrate Hermione's character by showing her character to us, rather than simply telling us what her character is. That is precisely what you should have done with Preston, and that is what I'm hoping you could do across the board with every companion in Elder Scrolls 6. Of course, in addition to the companions having fully fleshed out personalities, something that is just as important is how they assist you out in the field. For starters, they need to feel like they're actually your partners in the quests you do, not just there to be cannon fodder while you get all the glory. Hell, in Skyrim, most of the quests reacted to you as if you were alone, as if your followers were nothing more than summoned creatures. In Skyrim, one scene in particular that I would like to see more of in Elder Scrolls 6 is this scene right here.
Come on, we can do this. I know we can. He's up there on the balcony. Come on.
That right there. It seems like such a small moment, and in the grand scheme of things it probably is. But the simple act of your follower helping you to your feet after a rock slide just made all the difference in the world to me. It made Serana feel like a character. She felt like a person rather than just someone who stands in the background. Compare that to the Daedric quest, A Night to Remember. The whole point of that quest is trying to figure out what exactly you had done during your drunken tirade that you can't remember. However, if you have an active follower, is there any in-universe reason why you can't just have that follower fill you in on all the events that happened? Your follower is right there in the Temple of Debella when you sober up, so clearly they've been following you around this whole time. Is there any reason you can't just have the follower tell you everything you need to know, other than the fact that Bethesda just didn't program that dialogue option in? In Fallout 4, this was handled much better. Companions would often comment about where you were or what you were doing during your current active quest. Granted, it's still allowed for a few contrivances, like this moment, when I went to Valentine and had Dogmeat lead me to Kellogg. Then I went to the combat zone and got Kate for the first time, and fast traveled to Fort Hagen only for Kate to have this line.
Smart little mutt. He led us right to Kellogg. Why don't you have him run off and play so you can start your little reunion?
Wait, how does she know any of that? She wasn't around when we learned about Kellogg, so how does she know that I'm looking for him or that Dogmeat was supposed to take me to him? But frankly, I would take a contrivance like that over Skyrim's complete lack of follower engagement in the storylines any day of the week. Followers should also be able to help you solve puzzles in the dungeons. Obviously, the puzzles that require a follower to help you should not be necessary to complete the dungeon. We shouldn't force people to have followers if they prefer to go it alone. Instead, the puzzles should be easier if you have a follower, but not impossible without one, or they should only be used to shortcut through the dungeon or make the dungeon easier, such as disabling the Dwemer automatons or casting a dungeon-wide Turn Undead spell. Also, I would like it if the followers could serve as unofficial in-universe game guides. For example, they could offer hints or suggestions on how to proceed if you stay in one spot in the dungeon for too long. This would go a long way to making them feel more like partners than summoned creatures you just don't have to summon. As for how to raise the companion's affinity, I would prefer if I could do that by Radiant quests alone. I would still like the option of doing simple, repeatable actions like enchanting my gear in front of them, but I find it the most immersive if I can simply do quests to earn their favor. For example, I always felt like I truly earned Preston Garvey's affection by doing Minutemen quests, whereas I felt like I cheated my way to his approval by simply spamming weapon mods. I felt like I genuinely earned Piper's affection by repeatedly and consistently being nice to people in the game, rather than just picking locks all the time. In Elder Scrolls 6, I would like it if each companion had a Radiant quest that you could do over and over again to slowly earn their favor. For companions who were allied to a faction, the Radiant quests of that faction would obviously be used for that purpose. For independent companions, they should have some kind of Radiant quest that can be used to earn their approval. The important thing is that they have to be repeatable, so you can earn the companion's affinity through that quest alone. That way it would make sense in universe. That about does it for the companions, but there are plenty of characters you interact with in the Elder Scrolls who aren't your companions. That leads me to the first and foremost thing we need to bring back regarding regular NPCs is the small talk system. Oblivion's persuasion minigame was a complete disaster. Nobody in their right mind would deny that. But you kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater when you got rid of the persuasion system altogether. Instead of a return to Morrowind's system where you simply clicked admire over and over again and hoped that the RNG would play out in your favor, I would recommend a small talk system similar to that found in WWE 2K17 and WWE 2K18. In those games, when you cut a promo, whether you gained or lost points for each dialogue option depended on whether you selected a good, bad, or very bad dialogue option. However, how many points you gained or lost was dependent upon your might performance skill. A high might performance skill would get you more points for a good and very good dialogue choice, while reducing the penalties you suffered for a bad or very bad choice. Adopting a similar system of procedurally generated small talk in Elder Scrolls 6 would be ideal. It would be a great way for the player to have total control over the success of his small talk ability without having to grind points into his character's speech skill while still causing the speech skill to be relevant. With this system, you can get the maximum disposition boost from small talking regardless of your skill level, but at a lower speech skill it will just take more time to do it. This would actually be realistic. If I've known a guy for years, it shouldn't take as much charisma to get him to like me as someone I've just met. So spending more time socializing with someone should understandably yield a higher disposition. Of course, I would prefer if I could not get a maximum disposition with an NPC through small talk alone. For example, imagine if an NPC's disposition was divided into 4 sections: acquaintance, friend, ally, and best friend. Small talk could get me up to the maximum disposition per section, but I should need to do a favor for the NPC in order to boost me up to the next section. So suppose I use small talk to boost my disposition with an NPC up to 100 acquaintance. I could then have to do a quest for them, preferably a radiant quest so it can be procedurally generated and repeated indefinitely, or perhaps buy a lot of merchandise if I'm trying to win over a vendor. Doing a favor like that would reset the disposition back to 1, but would make me a friend of that NPC. Do that 3 times and I become their best friend. But I can only get up to 100 disposition through small talk alone. It cannot be used to upgrade me to the next section. In order to romance an NPC, I should need to get 100 disposition with a best friend. And yes, that does mean I would like the ability to romance NPCs who are not my companions, unlike in Fallout 4. After all, I should not have to marry a fighter if I'm not attracted to fighter-type characters. This, of course, transitions me into my next section. Skyrim introduced marriage into the Elder Scrolls games, and in a word, it was crap. I mean, Harry outside Windhelm will agree to marry you if you just sell her some stupid firewood. While she is easily the worst example of how marriage in Skyrim is handled, there are plenty of other examples that are almost as ridiculous. Like Uthgar the Unbroken, a woman who will marry you if you beat the snot out of her. Because that isn't destined to become an abusive relationship in any way, is it? Marriage should not be a spur-of-the-moment decision. I wouldn't expect anyone at Bethesda to understand, since 99% of the game developers working there probably never had a girlfriend in their lives, but people should be absolutely certain that they want you to be their spouse before they agree to marry you. As I pointed out, you should need to acquire best friend status with them and then get the highest disposition for that rank. This would require you invest a buttload of time and energy into your relationship before they can become romanced. Another restriction that I would like to see added to marriage in Elder Scrolls 6 in order to enhance realism is sexual orientation. It makes absolutely no sense to anyone would be willing to marry the player regardless of the player's sex. This is a problem that also exists in Fallout 4 as well, and it is dumb. I suppose the reason you put that in both Skyrim and Fallout 4 is because you wanted the player to be able to romance whoever they wanted without fear of rejection from your NPC of choice. But if that were the case, then I suppose I have to give you a pass for not knowing any better, since, again, most of you have never had a girlfriend. But that is not how relationships work. Besides, even if that is your reason, then it makes even less sense why you included the possibility of having your romantic advances rejected by your companions in Fallout 4 if you failed a charisma check. Now, I've heard some people argue against sexual orientation in the Elder Scrolls games, saying that if Bethesda put that in, they would have to make that the core of the NPC's personality and character. However, A, that is fucking offensive, and B, that is a completely baseless argument. The Dragon Age games have characters who will restrict who they enter into a romance with based on the player's sex, yet their sexuality is hardly the core of their personality. Take Liliana, for example. She's a bisexual companion in the first game of the franchise. As soon as you recruit her into your party, she makes no secret that she's into the women, with this line.
And there were no beautiful, charming women in the cloisters, you think? You would be wrong. There were many lovely young initiates in the Lothering cloister, all of them chaste and virtuous. It added to their mystique, because then they were forbidden, and forbidden fruit is the sweeter, no?
However, that is not the whole point of her character. She's a bard, and extremely devout to her religious beliefs. She enjoys when you help people, and when you select altruistic choices in the game. She is introduced into the game by having her plead for the lives of some people who picked a fight with you, arguing that there was no need to kill them. Her character is that of an altruistic heroine, and she just happens to like women. Besides, adding sexual orientation into an NPC's character would allow for several very interesting storylines, like convincing the NPC's family to give their blessing for your homosexual relationship. Or how about a woman who is listed in the game engine as being homosexual, but whose in-game dialogue suggests that she's bisexual? She's married to the guild leader, and then, when he dies and you take over as leader of the guild, par to the course for Elder Scrolls games by this point, you will have the option to romance this newly widowed woman, but only if you're playing as a female. If you're playing as a male, she will politely reject your advances on the grounds that, after her last husband, she can never love another man, so if she's to fall in love again, it would have to be with a woman. Aww. Now, wouldn't that be just adorable? Then again, hell, maybe you could hit gold by not doing that, and instead actually making a character's sexual orientation into the core of their character. After all, some of your most successful and beloved storylines were those where you threw subtlety out the window and just made the most intentionally unrealistic, over-the-top characters imaginable, like Sheogorath, or Oblivion's Dark Brotherhood, or Skyrim's Cicero. So maybe having somebody be a walking embodiment of every gay stereotype that every homophobic asshole has ever advanced would probably make him the most loved companion in the game. However, if you're going to do that, I would prefer it if you only did that once. Anyway, after you've married an NPC, I would prefer if marriage would actually unlock several different conversations, and not just here's your half of the store earnings that you never actually participate in managing line either. I mean actually talking about things, having the NPC open up to you in ways they would have never opened up to you before. Make each marriage a different experience. This would encourage multiple playthroughs because you have to marry each eligible NPC in order to learn everything there is to learn about their character. This would, of course, require that you scale down the number of NPCs in the game who are eligible to marry you. Then again, that's hardly a bad thing. Much like the number of companions, this is a case of quality over quantity. You should only need about 20 people, 10 from each sex, who you should be able to marry, and only about a third of them should display any LGBT tendencies. This is in stark contrast to the 30 women and 36 men in Skyrim that you could marry, many of whom are just palette swaps of one another. I'm much more interested in how much of a personality a woman has than how big her breasts are. Quality over quantity. Last but not least, I would like to make a request that could be seen as controversial. I would like your spouse to actually send you a Dear John letter and divorce you if you don't spend enough time with them. In Skyrim, I can't count the number of Let's Plays I've seen where a person gets married and then 50 episodes later completely forgets that they were even married in the first place because they haven't seen their wife in Akatosh knows how long, which kind of defeats the whole point of getting married in the first place. There are some professions where it makes sense that you would be away from your family for large periods of time, like being a soldier for instance, but freelance adventuring is hardly such a profession. But even then, even if it's a legitimate profession that requires you be away from your family despite being a legitimate profession, there are still some people out there who simply can't stand the loneliness, even if you have an excuse. Having a few NPCs who will divorce you if you're away for too long is realistic. Now, will this interfere with your life as an adventurer? Of course it will. But then again, it's kind of the whole point of why marriage was never an option in previous Elder Scrolls games, because it was wholly incompatible with the adventuring the Elder Scrolls games are supposed to be about. To balance your love life with your adventuring life, you should have to either A, marry an NPC who is eligible to be your companion, so you can do both at the same time, B, carefully plan your adventuring so that you can make regular trips back home frequently enough that your spouse doesn't become alienated, or C, wait until the end of the game before you take an arrow in the knee. Speaking of arrows in the knee, that transitions me to my last section for this week. Much like marriage, adoption in Skyrim was a complete dumpster fire. It carried absolutely no consequences whatsoever other than just making your house feel less empty. Parenthood should be a huge responsibility. It should be watered down for the sake of gameplay, but it should still be at least some responsibility for the sake of immersion. In Skyrim, they serve as nothing more than little roommates. To start with, you should have to leave them with at least one adult in the house. Otherwise, there's really no point to adopting them. Without an adult watching over them, all you're really giving them is a roof to protect them from the rain, which they could probably find on their own. Children who aren't looked after by responsible adults tend to develop extreme personality disorders later in life. This is common knowledge in the 21st century, and the most infuriating thing is, I know you actually know about this, because you've included that in one of your games already. Specifically, I'm referring to Aventus Aretino. After you kill Grella the Kind, Aventius never actually returns to the orphanage. Instead, he says he's going to grow up to be an assassin so he can save lots of children. Because he doesn't have a good, responsible adult like his mother or Constance Michelle to teach him right from wrong, he believes the Dark Brotherhood are the good guys. And you know what? Aventus isn't even the only example. Braith is a big bully in Whiterun, but if you actually follow her around and observe her Radiant AI, you realize that it's because her parents both suck donkey dick at parenting that she has this personality. The only other examples she can learn from are the Nords who dominate Whiterun, who always try to act all tough and bar brawlish with each other, which may explain her attitude problem. So if you're aware of the sort of psychological damage that can come from a child not having an adult caretaker during their childhoods, why do you still allow us to adopt children and then never interact with those kids ever again with no consequences? So you should have to leave an adult to look after your children. Maybe your spouse, or perhaps some sort of live-in manservant or bodyguard that you hire or have appointed to you, like a steward or housecarl. If you leave them unattended for more than a day, the government should take your children away from you and force you to attend parenting lessons to get your kids back. You can't just sit your character down at the appropriate chair and then leave the game unattended for about 30 minutes either, because the game will ask you questions about the lecture you just heard. So you have to actually pay attention to the lectures, not simply your character. That'll teach you to leave your kids unattended, won't it? So not only should you have to leave your kids with an adult, but you should also have to punish them if they do bad things. You should script the children to actually do bad things. If you aren't around when it happens, then the adult you leave in charge of your children should have to tell you what they did in your absence, and when you have to decide on a punishment for them. A punishment that is too harsh would get your kids taken away and trigger the aforementioned mandatory classes because you're an abusive parent. But a punishment that is too soft should have them taking on a Braith-like character traits. Now, this might put off some players from adopting children. However, that's realistic. Knowing that parenting is a huge responsibility in the real world will often put off people from having kids. So having a similar, albeit watered down, level of responsibility for parenthood and the subsequent choice of whether or not to even have kids in the first place as a result of that responsibility would add greatly to immersion. Put in simplest terms, the cities need to be bigger. Now, I understand that hardware is going to be a limitation, but there are ways around that. For example, you can divide the cities into sectors, separated by load doors, in order to make it easier on the hardware, much like you did with the Imperial City in Oblivion. In fact, I would like it if you did that. Have the city be divided into distinct social classes, with upper, middle, and lower class residents having entire districts to themselves. Imagine if, in Riften, the Beggar's Row wasn't just a small section in the sewer, but rather was an entire section the size of vanilla Riften that was equally run down and equally slummy to the Beggar's Row, but housed about 100 beggars across 20 to 25 different beggar families. In fact, the cities could have 4 lower-class sectors, 2 middle-class sectors, a single upper-class sector, a commercial zone, and a sector for the Capitol building. That would create a total of 9 sectors, which you could arrange in a 3x3 grid. Each one of the residential zones would have about 50 to 100 people living in them. That transitions me to my next major point. We need larger populations. Vendors need multiple employees instead of just one assistant, if even that many. For the larger companies, I would actually prefer if the owners weren't actually the vendors you directly interacted with. Rather, I would prefer if the owners were in an office above the store, and the vendors at the counter were employees who swapped in and out during shifts. Meanwhile, 2 or 3 other assistants would be wandering around the shops doing animations suggesting that they're keeping the place tidy and in order. To help illustrate this, take a look at this clip from a recent playthrough of Fallout 4. As you can clearly see, I have a settler manning a weapons counter. Meanwhile, in the back, I've got 2 other settlers working at weapons workbenches. The implication here is that the vendor's stock is being made on site by his 2 helpers in the back. I accomplished this with the use of a mod called Busy Settlers, which created alternate versions of the crafting stations which settlers could be assigned to. I will provide a link to this mod in the description if you're interested. That is what I would ideally like to see in Elder Scrolls 6. The guilds would obviously be the largest employers in the cities. The Fighters Guild was not disbanded as of the events of Skyrim, rather they simply had no branches in Skyrim. So I would like to see the Fighters Guild make a return in Elder Scrolls 6, and I would like it if they easily had about 100 to 200 mercenaries working and living there in each city. Now granted, this would obviously create plot holes for you trying to create backstories and personalities for these characters. However, I think a suitable compromise would be creating unique personalities and backstories only for the characters who are important. NPCs who only exist to pad the population and to make the cities look as densely populated as a real city would look would have generic names. For example, I asked for about 1 to 200 mercs working at the Fighters Guild. These mercs would, of course, be generic and have no unique names, and instead simply being called Fighters Guild Associate or Fighters Guild Apprentice, and so on. The exceptions being NPCs who are actually important to the Fighters Guild quest lines. These guys would be fully fleshed out, have clear personalities, backstories, and character arcs. This way, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have unique, individual NPCs and still have large populations. This would be realistic too. I can walk down the aisles of my grocery store and see a man looking at a jar of pasta, reading the ingredients to make sure it's right for him. He probably has a unique life story that gives him a unique personality, but does he have any reason to tell me, a total stranger, his life story the minute I start talking to him? I doubt it. Having some NPCs be introverts to the player makes it more realistic and, by proxy, more immersive. I would also like to see people have jobs that are away from their homes. Small business owners would obviously be an exception, since their profits are probably too small to be able to afford more than one parcel of land. But upperclassmen who own the biggest companies in the commercial zones, as well as the employees at those companies, should all have homes in the residential districts that are separate from their places of work. Speaking of the businesses themselves, that is my next point. In the major cities, I would like to see a minimum of 2 businesses providing each service. To my knowledge, Tamriel still operates under a capitalist economy. Well, competition is the bread and butter of capitalism. Companies need to be able to compete with each other in order for the economy to truly thrive. However, I would prefer if the competing companies were not interchangeable with each other. For example, 2 inns could compete with each other, one of them charging less but offering poorer accommodations, with the other charging more but having much grander rooms for you. The more expensive companies can probably offer a wider range of stock to their customers, while the smaller firms probably have fewer selection of goods but charge less for the few goods they do have, since they don't have as many employees to pay and their overhead costs aren't as high since they don't import from all over Tamriel. You could also have each business owner have a unique personality that you may like or dislike. If you're into roleplay, your character could refuse to do business with a company that is owned by a super snotty upperclassman, even if they may have slightly better goods for sale. Of course, the vendors could also refuse to do business with you in turn. I would like it if quests would sometimes force you to side with one merchant or the other, and whoever you don't side with will permanently refuse to deal with you for the rest of the game. For example, one of the smaller merchants may want you to commit some sort of industrial sabotage against his juggernaut competition. You could go through with his plan or report his plan to the guards, who would slap him with a huge fine. Of course, you wouldn't need to program in a reduction in the quality of the merchant's wares as a result of this fine, because the merchant would refuse to deal with the player if you didn't side with them. You can assume the fine the lesser merchant suffered wasn't enough to put him in bankruptcy, but enough for him to hate you, and if you sabotaged the bigger merchant, we can assume that he has enough connections elsewhere to rebuild quickly. But you won't need to actually program in any reduction in the quality of goods, because the player, without mods or console commands, would never see the merchant's stock after that quest. Having NPCs refuse to deal with you is a great way for the player's actions to have consequences. This is a common complaint about the Elder Scrolls games, and one that I have to agree with. The player makes huge, world-changing decisions in these games, but you never see any real fallout from those decisions. If you complete the Civil War questline in favor of the Stormcloaks, the Moot never convenes, Ulfric never moves to Solitude, and the former Imperial supporting Jarls are never exiled from the Blue Palace. When you defeat Alduin, only a handful of people even acknowledge your feat, and defeating him doesn't appear to have any noticeable impact on the world. Even the dragons will continue to randomly attack. Presumably that is so you can continue to collect dragon souls, bones, and scales for the rest of the game, but it's still immersion breaking. Granted, some of the major changes that the player sets in motion would be very difficult to program. For example, programming in a moot convention would require hundreds of man-hours of programming and voice acting, which hardly seems worth it, especially considering that the player could very easily just not attend the convention himself, which would make the whole thing a waste of time anyway. But my suggestion of having NPCs hate you if you go against their wishes in a quest is a great way for the actions of the player to have consequences without having to program in major changes to the game world. We'll go into more detail about how the quests should be handled next week when we actually conclude Elder Scrolls 6 Month. I would like to see some businesses be open 24/7. In addition to the major retailers who have vendors working in shifts, I would also like to see several manufacturing-related businesses stay open 24/7. For example, a mining settlement could be supported by a single mine which is worked 24/7. Since you are already underground and can't see the sun anyway, the inability to see at night isn't going to make a difference in the ability to work that mine. The mine could have about 20 ore veins in it, with 60 miners working in 3 different shifts of 8 hours each, and who each have 1 ore vein which they dig at for that duration of their shifts. That would instantaneously give us 60 NPCs who can mass assign their Radiant AI schedules to, giving us access to the aforementioned large populations without having to sacrifice Radiant AI to get us there. Other companies could have similar workforces. For example, a blacksmith firm could have 1 guy per shift working each of the smithing stations: smelter, forge, tanning rack, grindstone, and armor workbench. The weapons and armor being produced at these blacksmithing companies could be made using assembly lines, allowing for larger populations where everybody has a job. Except maybe the beggars. Outside the major cities, I would like it if there were large farms, growing both food and alchemy ingredients, stationed on the major roads. These farms should have about a half a dozen farm hands helping to grow the crops, just as the companies in the cities should have about a half a dozen employees per shift. It would greatly increase immersion if the cities actually got their supplies from somewhere other than a magical, self-respawning merchant's chest. Speaking of supplying the cities, I would really like it if we could find caravans on the roads, traveling back and forth between the cities and the farms and mining settlements who supply them. You could have crates in their wagons and about 4 mercs guarding the caravans. These crates could be stolen from if you either remain undetected or manage to deal with the guards and carriage drivers, and would contain huge caches, so the reward is well worth the risk. These mercs could be seen from time to time having to fight off a group of bandits in order to increase immersion. In addition, I would greatly appreciate the opportunity to set up your own businesses, and possibly even hire employees to work them in your absence. You could purchase a vacant plot of land in the commercial zones in your cities, or even go out and clear out some mine or plot of land in the overworld to set up a mining settlement or farm there. You could then hire NPCs in the game to work those businesses in your absence, and pull regular money from them as the business turns a profit, as well as providing you with a buttload of resources to use in your own crafting skills. The next thing I would like to see in order to make the cities more believable and immersive is an address system. In Skyrim, the fact that couriers were able to find you in the middle of nowhere, despite having absolutely no in-universe means of tracking you, was absurd. Instead, I would like to see an address system implemented in Elder Scrolls 6. The address that the player's mail would be sent to would be determined by the player's primary residence. The first time you purchase a player home, the player home automatically becomes your primary residence. If you have multiple player homes, you can update your primary residence by speaking with whatever you call the equivalent of the steward in your new province. If you don't yet have a player home, then the inn you most recently stayed at will be considered your primary residence, since inns in the Elder Scrolls universe will often double as apartments. That almost does it for the cities. However, there is one final request I would like to make. A request for an entirely new feature. Like the double team kill moves from part 1 of this series, this hasn't yet happened in the Elder Scrolls games. Well, sort of happened, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I think it would be totally boss if you could do it. Everyone was disappointed that Skyrim didn't have an arena in it. I, myself, find it weird that the people of Tamriel have no sports aside from combat. It's not disappointing per se, it's just weird is all. There are plenty of pacifist NPCs who detest violence, but the game forces you into wilderness due to the simple fact that there's nothing fun to do in the cities. This begs the question, just what do the NPCs do to try to avoid being driven insane out of boredom? No wonder vanilla test games seem to have no sober beverages. Being drunk off their asses is the only way to take their minds off the sheer boredom of city life. In Elder Scrolls 6, I'd like to see a sports arena in the major cities. Pay for a ticket to watch the game, or maybe even bet on the outcome. There's no reason why you would have to restrict yourself to ancient sports such as Roman gladiatorial arenas or horse racing. This is a fictional universe with an entirely separate world history from our own. So get creative and make up about 3 to 5 sports of your own, with your own rules. Create teams for each major city of each province that's still on good terms with the Empire. Have the crowds root for their own home teams. An element of randomness would be added to each game to add an element of uncertainty to the games. Will one of the players successfully catch the ball being thrown to them? When cornered, will the athlete try to escape or pass the ball to a teammate? Would one player, when trying to obstruct an opposing player, accidentally commit a foul? If so, which foul? I'd also like to see the ability to take your spouse and kids to the sporting events with you, as a family bonding moment. In addition to sporting events, these arenas could also double up as ancient Greek-style amphitheaters to hold various plays when they aren't hosting sporting events. Imagine historical battles, such as the battle for the Imperial City during the Oblivion main quest, like the Dragonfires, being retold in front of you by actors. Of course, since you, as opposed to your character, was at the battle for the Imperial City, you'll notice a lot of creative liberties, yeah, that's it, taken with the source material. It has, after all, been more than 200 years since that battle happened. As well as theaters and sporting events, I would also like to see card games being played in the local pubs. You can even participate in the card games yourself, betting in-game currency in these card games. You can't deny that this would be an awesome thing to have. But as we step outside of the cities, the next thing we encounter is... First, let's address the issue of enemy and loot scaling. Quite frankly, your intentions might have been honest when you introduced scaling back in Oblivion, but the bottom line is that your execution couldn't have been more off. Good intentions will only get you so far if you simply don't do it right. The whole point of an RPG is that you start out weak and frail, but slowly and painstakingly level your character up to demigod levels. That is literally the whole point of an RPG. It's an extremely satisfying feeling when you can look back at your older battles and see just how much you struggled with the simplest of enemies, only for you to now cut through enemies 20 times their level like butter. Furthermore, the feeling that you actually got this far through your own hard work, your own blood, sweat, and tears, gives you a sense of accomplishment. Enemy scaling takes this satisfaction away. Because the world scales with you, you don't really level up, you just avoid falling behind. There's nothing satisfying about that. Now, I understand why you did it. At high enough levels, you can be too powerful for the game to pose a challenge. If you can steamroll through even the toughest of enemies, the game is no longer worth playing. You wanted the player to be able to just pick a dungeon, any dungeon, and know that this dungeon would pose a challenge to you regardless of your level. I understand that. But there are a few things you need to keep in mind. First, it's a choice between either that or having no sense of progression or advancement from leveling up, which is the whole point of an RPG and the main source of a sense of accomplishment in that genre. So which is the lesser of two evils here? Second, the simple bottom line is that games need to have a finite end to them. We can't just keep playing indefinitely, we need to move on to more games. Third, the main source of enjoyment we get out of the Elder Scrolls games is from exploring the world, meeting new people, and acquiring new quests. No amount of keeping the combat on our level is going to compensate for that. Besides, combat is just boring in most Elder Scrolls games anyway. I found Fallout 4's combat engine to be engaging and enjoyable for reasons I've already discussed in part 1 of this mini-series. However, the source of the enjoyment of combat in Fallout 4 isn't something that can be continued indefinitely as the enemies get stronger. The main improvement you made in Fallout 4's combat engine was the way every enemy had different AI and strategies. Once you've learned all the strategies and tactics that different types of enemies will use, then you've figured out combat. While it's rewarding to figure out the enemy's AI and exploit that to your advantage, there's only a finite number of times you can do that. Scaling the enemies to your level isn't going to breathe new life into the combat system. It's just going to make the fights take longer. So how would I fix enemy scaling in Elder Scrolls 6? Well, I actually like Fallout 4's system of enemy scaling. The enemies get stronger as you progress further south, rather than simply being scaled to your level. This gave the people a general idea of where to go for an in-game challenge without breaking the fourth wall. However, I always found that to be a bit arbitrary, as there is no in-universe explanation why the Deathclaws and Rad Scorpions of the Glowing Sea wouldn't simply migrate north in search of easier prey. So here is my proposal to fix that immersion problem. Instead of having the enemies get stronger as you migrate in one cardinal direction, you have the enemies get stronger as you get farther away from cities and roads. Now, wouldn't that make sense? It actually seems plausible that strong enemies who are near the roads and cities would be picked off by the guards before they can become too much of a threat, while enemies more detached from society would survive to develop their combat skills more. Granted, that would still create a question of how they developed their combat skills despite having incredibly strong predators nearby. But we can explain that away in-universe by saying that the creatures and NPCs in the farthest reaches of the game map are forced to be ruthless to survive. By contrast, the guards in the cities are just as powerful as the predators in the deep wilds, but are trained not to attack anyone who isn't a threat. So creatures and NPCs near the cities and roads are lulled into a false sense of security and grow into adulthood, while only obtaining minimal combat skills, only for those lack of combat skills to come back and bite them in the butt whenever they try to cause trouble. This would give the players plenty of opportunity to seek out end-game challenges. They will have an idea where the end-game challenges are located without having to look up a guide online. The only time they would need a guide to find the toughest dungeons is if they were looking for the absolute roughest, toughest dungeon in the entire game. We'll go into further detail about the dungeons in a minute. As far as navigating the overworld is concerned, I would actually recommend you make the quest markers optional. Now, I understand the reason you implemented the quest markers. The direction system you used in Morrowind was completely broken. In the first few hours of the game, the directions were sufficiently specific and accurate, but keeping that up for hundreds of quests, the tedium of writing these directions eventually began to wear on your developers. About halfway through the faction quest lines, NPCs would just start saying that the dungeon you were meant to go to was west of the city. Well, what exactly counts as west? How far west? Even if the NPCs provided landmarks for you to look for, many players would notice other landmarks and assume those were what the NPC was talking about. In Morrowind, online guides were practically required to play the game. But perhaps the worst example was the Mages Guild questline Warlock's Ring, where the directions actually sent the player in the complete opposite direction they were supposed to go. So how would I fix the direction system? Well, I would give the player the option of using quest markers, but I would also prefer to substitute the directions system for a GPS system. Have the white gold tower be at coordinates 0, 0, and then assign GPS coordinates to every other location in the game. These GPS coordinates would be given automatically by the NPC's dialogue. Just as some letters in Skyrim will have the player's name attached to them using a sort of mail merge type system, I would prefer if NPC's directions would automatically generate the coordinates for the front door of the destination dungeon. If somebody creates a mod that causes the quest to happen in a new dungeon, the coordinates for that dungeon would automatically update unless the modder specifically modifies the dialogue as well. By having the coordinates be automatically generated, this would eliminate the possibility of the directions being wrong, without forcing the player to follow an immersion-breaking quest marker if they don't want to. As for the roads, as I pointed out, I would prefer for the enemies near the roads to only be minor nuisances like wolves and rats, the sort of enemies that non-combatant farmers alongside the roads could easily deal with using their woodcutter's axes. However, as for the NPCs, I would like there to be two types of farms dotting the roads. One type growing food and the other type growing alchemy ingredients. At the halfway point between the cities, two inns could be found on opposite sides of the roads, one for the working class and one for the wealthy. I would also prefer it if a majority of the sides of the roads were occupied by farms, inns, mines, and military outposts. You've got all this land next to the road, so why not use it? Of course, you wouldn't have fast travel markers next to them, since the fast travel markers would just get heavily cluttered if you did that. Instead, the halfway points, which have the inns and the military outposts, should be the only roadside locations to have map markers. Last but not least, I would like it if there were more things to explore underwater. In Skyrim, with the exception of Pilgrim's Trench, there just wasn't a whole lot of reason to go underwater exploring. Hell, even in relatively shallow waters like the White River, there wasn't a whole lot of Easter eggs or alchemy ingredients to find. Maybe the occasional fish could be caught underwater, but those were few and far between. Think of the possibilities. Imagine if there were a group of Argonian bandits who kept their booty in a crevice underwater, under the assumption that nobody would think to look there, and even if they did, they would need water breathing to be able to get to it. A diary from the Argonian bandit chief would reveal the location to you. Imagine if there were entire dungeons that took place entirely underwater. Obviously, this would require that you bring back underwater combat, but that was a sadly missed game mechanic even in Skyrim, which didn't have a whole lot to do underwater even as is. But of course, at this point, I'm just brainstorming ideas. That's your job. The point is, don't give us this huge overworld of about 16 to 20 square miles, and then make a fifth of it completely empty. Speaking of the dungeons, that transitions me to... In Oblivion, one man was single-handedly responsible for creating over 200 dungeons. I don't care if he was your best level designer. Asking one man to create 200 dungeons is going to result in a nosedive in quality just due to sheer burnout. We know from the documentary The Making of Oblivion that he used the construction set to put together the dungeons, which means he used preset dungeon pieces like they were Lego blocks. This meant that every dungeon looked and felt almost exactly the same, and it was boring. Skyrim saw a huge increase in the quality of your dungeons because you used a different strategy. Instead of having your best level designer go it alone, there were a team of about 10 dungeon designers. This meant that each guy only needed to design about 20 dungeons apiece. This severely cut back on the burnout and allowed each designer to put their best into each dungeon, this is definitely a step in the right direction. However, there are still some improvements that can be made. For starters, the puzzles in the game are so easy to solve that they almost seem patronizing, almost as if they were designed for a much younger audience than the M rating suggests. Hell, the Paper Mario games, which are intended for a young audience, still require at least a little bit more thought than the puzzles found in Skyrim. Here's the biggest problem with the puzzles in Skyrim. The game literally gives you the answer in plain sight. Along with the phrase arrow in the knee, this has become one of Skyrim's most reviled aspects. Countless memes and YouTube videos have been created poking fun at how insultingly simple the puzzles are.
Man, look, the combination is on the claw.
It's not the combination.
What?
It's a trick.
It's not a trick.
They would never make it that easy.
But they did, though.
Then why make a combination at all?
I have no fucking idea.
And the best part of all this is, instead of fessing up and admitting that you screwed up, you actually tried to save face by quietly adding in a book during one of your batches that said that the puzzles were designed to keep the Draugr from escaping, rather than keeping adventurers out.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
Ignoring for a minute that this was clearly a post-release edition, meaning it is a blatant cop-out, it is still demonstrably false. For starters, these intelligence-insulting puzzles are found in every dungeon in Skyrim, not just the Draugr ruins. Second, NPCs in the game are routinely fooled by these puzzles and repeatedly commend you for your ability to decipher them. If the puzzles are supposed to be this easy for a living person, why is this guy right here getting killed by the poison darts when he fails? Why is this enemy soldier laying dead at this door, presumably killed by the poison darts that hit him when he couldn't figure out the claw combination? Why is my commander commending me for my ability to figure this claw out, acting like I'm some sort of prodigy? And if the traps are for the Draugr, why is it, when you get the puzzle wrong, you get hit by poison darts, when the Draugr are immune to poison? If the darts are supposed to just be a means of forcing the Draugr to back away from the door, like barbed wire for cows, then why do they need to be tipped with poison which isn't going to affect the Draugr? Thus, they are clearly intended to be difficult in-universe, even if they're actually easy to an intelligence-insulting level. Third, even if we accept that these puzzles are so simple in-universe because they're designed to keep the Draugr out, it ultimately doesn't matter. At the end of the day, these dungeons exist for our amusement. At the end of the day, the bottom line is that, even if there's an in-universe explanation for the puzzles being so simple, that doesn't make it good game design. And no amount of in-universe explanations, no matter how plausible they are going to exempt you from that. So, for the Elder Scrolls 6, I want better puzzles. Good puzzle designers are out there. There are plenty of games out there that have great, mind-bending puzzles. There are plenty of developers out there who know how to make good puzzles for your dungeons, so go out and hire yourself a few. As I mentioned earlier in this mini-series, I would like to see puzzles that may actually require 2 or more people to solve. These puzzles would obviously have to be optional to complete the dungeon, or if they're mandatory to complete the dungeons themselves should be optional. If the two-person puzzles are required, the dungeons housing them should not even so much as be candidates for Radiant quests. This way, players wouldn't be forced to have companions if they didn't want them. In addition to better puzzles, I would also like to see alternate routes in the dungeons. The castles that were relevant to Oblivion's Thieves Guild questline would often have hidden passages that you could use to slip away to different parts of the castle unnoticed, which did wonders for role-playing and immersion. Skyrim did away with the alternate routes in the Thieves Guild dungeons, but added in some escape routes in most of the jails, making it easier to escape jail without being detected. Both of these were splendid additions to the stealth gameplay of their respective games, and for Elder Scrolls 6, I would like to see these less obvious alternate paths not only return, but be expanded upon and find their way into the dungeons as well. These paths should probably be on hard-to-reach ledges, perhaps even places that can't be reached without jumping, making them perfect spots for sniping enemies or even slipping past them entirely. These places should be shrouded in darkness and should be non-obvious, so as the player, you have to keep your eyes peeled to notice them, but they should still exist. The fact that they are hidden should be part of the dungeon's level design on purpose, since we need it to make sense in-universe why the inhabitants of the dungeon don't simply guard that area. And as a matter of game design, it should feel rewarding when you discover them. There should also be shortcuts in the dungeons that you can traverse underwater, in keeping with my aforementioned request of there being more stuff to find underwater. Heck, imagine if the door that's supposed to be the way out of the dungeon after you complete it actually has a key to unlock it. There are two instances of this key. One of them is dropped by the boss when you kill him, and the other is located at the bottom of some pool in the first room of the dungeon, not in a chest, but as a loose item. You find that key, and you can cut straight to the end of the dungeon and defeat the boss immediately. Now, wouldn't that be rewarding to actually find that shortcut? I would like for some of the dungeons to be non-linear. For example, suppose you need a key to unlock the door to the boss chambers. But there are 3 instances of the key in the dungeon, and you only have to complete one string of rooms to get a single copy of that key. Or imagine if the key to the boss's chambers isn't even in the dungeon at all, but is instead found in a separate dungeon. Why isn't it in the dungeon it's supposed to go with? Well, because another adventurer had done this dungeon already, and had already gotten the key. But then he went back to a city to replenish his supplies, got a quest for another dungeon that seemed to be a bit more urgent, so he went off and did that dungeon instead, only to die in that dungeon. So the key is actually on his corpse, along with a diary explaining what had happened. Last but not least, I would like there to be a definitive super dungeon in the game. Many RPGs will have an optional super boss. Skyrim had the Ebony Warrior as a super boss, while Oblivion had Umbra as a super boss. Well, I would like to see Elder Scrolls 6 have a super dungeon. The sort of dungeon that will rip you to shreds, unless you're using an exploit or glitch to give yourself millions of health and magicka. As you enter the main gate of this dungeon, it would lock behind you, or maybe you would have to drop down from a ledge, or you would be prohibited in some other capacity from simply exiting the dungeon until you've completed it. This would require the player to spend a buttload of time preparing for the dungeon and getting all his gear ready, prioritizing his potions, scrolls, and soul gems. The enemies in the dungeon should be in triple-digit levels. They should be juiced out beyond recognition. Every battle should be a brutal, bloody fight to the death, with the player having only about 1/10 of his health remaining after each fight. There should be about 50 to 60 interior cells in the dungeon, separated by low doors, and only about 5 or 6 opportunities to replenish your supplies and rest to restore your health. Completing this dungeon should be an achievement, and there would be competitions online to see who can beat the dungeon at the lowest possible level. Okay, let's be brutally honest here, your side quests suck. There are only a handful of side quests in your games that you actually put any real effort or creativity into. It's harsh, but it's true. Right now, I would like to play a clip from a video from a guy named Mr. Caption. Some of you might remember him as the guy who I was replying to in my video about the Institute being Knights Templar, which you can watch by clicking on the card that I provide right here. Anyway, I would like to play this clip from his 4-part review of Skyrim.
I do not understand the appeal of these quests. Of all the quests I've played, and I tried to play a lot of them, I found myself doing a lot of either walking into a dungeon or fetching a thing, and oftentimes a combination of those two. But the amount of fetch quests in Skyrim is insane. Like, for example, this Dawnbreaker sword thing. It makes zombies explode. Awesome. How do I get it? You run through a dungeon. You run through a dungeon and you kill a guy at the end who has a bunch of pet ghosts. Okay, what about this Azora's Star thing? Where do I get that? Dungeon. Surprise, am I right? Right now, right in Whiterun, I can remember at least 3 quests where I had to just go somewhere, get a thing, or come back, and that was the quest.
While I do love the Elder Scrolls games a buttload, I have to agree that his criticism of your side quests is not unfounded. I would like to see quest objectives that are a bit more varied in the Elder Scrolls 6. The few quests that aren't go through a dungeon and grab this MacGuffin usually involve getting to the bottom of a mystery, usually a murder mystery. With maybe the exception of the Forsworn Conspiracy, most of these detective quests are solved simply by discovering the culprit's journal or some other incriminating document that the culprit wrote. Think about it. Corruption in conscience, incriminating letter. Blood on the ice, incriminating journal. Laid to rest, incriminating journal. Mercer Frey and the Thieves Guild quest line, incriminating journal. Seriously, Bethesda? Is that the best you can do? Not only does it make the criminals look like complete dumbasses for leaving these incriminating things where anybody can find them, but it also makes the guards look completely incompetent when they can't find the killer's lair when there is literally a trail of blood leading directly to it. But Morrowind has the worst example. In Satanin, you can come across a dead body out in the marsh, outside of Satanin proper. Talking to the victim's girlfriend will get you the suspect of foreign Gilnith. Go and confront him with the accusation and he'll openly confess to committing the crime. What? Huh? What? You've gotta be kidding me! Who in their right mind would confess to killing someone? Oh, sure, he says that the taxman was embezzling the tax money. But even if he could prove that, which, for the record, he doesn't even attempt to offer any evidence to support that accusation, why would he confess to a blatant act of vigilantism? This is the sort of mystery I would expect to be the plot of some episode of some Nick Jr. cartoon. You know, those shows meant for really, really little kids? The only way these detective quests could be more patronizing is if you literally put a blue paw print on the journal you were supposed to find. Oh wait, you already do that because of the damn quest markers. Elder Scrolls games are rated M for mature. Maybe you should treat your target audience accordingly. So here's a suggestion. Bethesda, instead of using entirely in-house writing talent, why not solicit the services of an acclaimed murder mystery novelist to write our detective stories for us? Flynn Barry is a good one. Have your in-house talent actually program these stories into an actual quest or quest line you can do, but an acclaimed murder mystery author should be at the head of the writing department for those quests. Hell, you could make this murder mystery the primary focus of an entire quest line. Suppose you could make the Penitus Oculatus into a joinable faction in Elder Scrolls 6. Then someone in the Emperor's extended family could be murdered and you'd be charged with finding the culprit. Finding and executing him could be the climax of the quest line, with the culprit himself being the final boss. Honestly, I would like that. It's the whole quality over quantity argument. But if you insist on the detective quests being side quests, at the very least, force us to actually do some, detective work. Make us actually figure out who the bad guy is. Give us multiple suspects who we can confront with the accusation, with the possibility of getting it wrong. I don't mean the way Blood on the Ice did it either. In that quest, you are told point blank to go to the steward and accuse the court mage of being the killer, even though he wasn't the killer. You could confront the court mage with the accusation first, but the game never directs you there. The only way you would ever know to go to him directly is if you already knew from past playthrough or an online guide that he actually was innocent. No, instead of that, give me multiple options of who to accuse. Give me the choice of any of those three, and make me choose one suspect to accuse and force me to set everyone else free. Make it so that the evidence definitively points to one specific person, but also make it so that a person who isn't on the ball may very easily accuse the wrong person. You'd have to notice a very specific piece of evidence or a very specific order in which the evidence took place in order to accuse the right person the first time. For example, you may recall in my video about Sadia and the Alakir. If you haven't seen that video yet, you can click on the card that I provide right here. You will notice that I point out how Kamadu's story doesn't add up, and one of the biggest pieces of evidence I offer is that the Second Treaty of Stros-Makai, which ended the war between Hammerfell and the Dominion, was enacted 20 years before the events of Skyrim, meaning that Sadia was only a little girl when Kamadu says she committed the treason. This information was not handed to me on a silver platter. There was no dialogue option that became available after I read a specific journal where my character pointed out how much time has passed since the war. This is something that I had to figure out all on my own. However, I have no way of knowing if this was Bethesda's original intention or not with that quest. Did Bethesda write this quest knowing that Kamadu was supposed to accuse Sadia of an act of treason she couldn't possibly have committed? Or is this just a slip-up in the lore caused by a lack of communication between the different departments at Bethesda? In Elder Scrolls 6, I would like the fallout of these detective quests to make it 100% clear if there was any evidence that I overlooked or if I analyzed the evidence incorrectly. But during the quest, I would like it if the evidence is of the sort where you really need to have a keen eye for detail in order to notice it the first time. Speaking of accusing the wrong guy, that leads me to my next point. Quests need to have the possibility of failure. There's no fun in doing a quest if we can't fail them. There's no challenge. Once again, I must include a clip from one of my fellow YouTubers, Samuel Online, from his video The Elder Scrolls The Dumbing Down.
In Skyrim particularly, quests are structured so that you simply cannot fail them, beyond dying or simply not completing them. No chance to betray someone, no chance to completely blow the opportunity that you've got. Such as, I don't know, capture a rare badger alive, and if you couldn't capture it in the allotted time, then you failed. Or if it dies, then you failed. Welcome to a real RPG, and no, you don't get another try. In Skyrim, it is harder to lose than it is to win.
Yeah, what he said. Please fix that in the Elder Scrolls 6. Granted, in Skyrim you could fail some quests, but frankly you had to go out of your way to fail them. For example, the Daedric quest of the Taste of Death can be failed if Iola dies. However, Iola is a protected NPC. Now, if you've seen part 2 of this discussion series, you know that protected means that she can only die if the player directly kills her. But if you kill her, does that really count as failing the quest in the strictest sense of the word? In Elder Scrolls 6, there should be quests where you have to keep the quest character alive, and if they die, then you fail. There should be quests where you have to intercept a courier and steal the package he was delivering, and if you miss your opportunity to intercept him, then you fail. In a detective quest, you should be tasked with collecting evidence to exonerate an innocent man on death row, and if you can't find the evidence in time, then you fail. This is not complicated stuff. Plenty of other RPGs in the past and present have quests that you can fail in a multitude of ways, not the least of which is running off and leaving the NPCs involved in the quest to fend for themselves. Think about it this way. This is not merely the whole point of an RPG. This is literally the whole point of a video game, period. Literally the whole point of playing video games is to challenge yourself. For single-player games like the Elder Scrolls, you're not playing against other people, you're playing against the game. That means that the game needs to fight back. Beating the game should be a challenge, and there's no challenge without the possibility of failure. If the player character is simply destined to win, then that just means it's an interactive movie, not a game where the player tests his skills. If I can get the same experience by watching a movie, then you have failed as a game designer. Let's take the Skyrim Civil War quest line for example. The only real branching point in the quest line is when you decide which army to fight for. When you complete the Jagged Crown quest, you have the opportunity to switch sides just that one time, but that's it. Once you have chosen a side, the Civil War questline is entirely linear. Now imagine if, instead of simply giving the Jagged Crown to the other side, there was the possibility you might not get to the crown first at all. Imagine if there were some conditions you could meet where the enemy got the Jagged Crown, but you're still fighting for your original army. Because the Jagged Crown, in lore, is a symbol of ancient Nordic tradition, imagine if the enemy army suddenly had a lot more numbers to them due to the large number of Nords flocking to that army, causing subsequent battles against them to be much harder. Whereas your army would have that numbers advantage if you had the Jagged Crown yourself. If the enemy had the crown, you, as the player character, would have to fight extra fiercely to prevent your army from losing the battles. Or alternatively, imagine if, in some of these pre-battle quests where you have to rescue POWs or frame the steward or deliver fake documents to the enemy, you have the possibility of failing those quests, and if you fail them, you go into the subsequent battle at a disadvantage. That leads me to my next point. In addition to the possibility of failure, we also need the opportunity for branching storylines. Skyrim had several quests where you could betray the quest giver and side with his enemy, but that is the most bare-bones version of a branching storyline there is. Come on, Bethesda, you can do better than that. In the Skyrim Civil War questline, we essentially did the same quests regardless of which army we sided with. The only difference is that we did some of the pre-fork quests in a different order. For example, if you side with the Stormcloaks, you do the quest where you rescue the POWs from the fort before you do the quest where you blackmail the steward, and then you do the quest where you deliver a fake letter to the enemy camp to lull them into a false sense of security. Whereas with the Imperials, you do those 3 quests in reverse order. That is not a branching storyline. That's just doing the quests in opposite order as we move in the opposite direction. Imagine if the entire quest line changed depending on what we did during key points in the quest line. Like the actual story itself would change depending on what we do. Think about it this way. What's the point in giving us the ability to create our own characters with our own backstories and character motivations if you're just going to force us to adhere to the linear scripted stories that you've written for us? In Skyrim, if we're role-playing as a retired vigil of Stendarr, a character who despises Daedra worship in all its forms, we have no choice but to break our beliefs and become a werewolf, aka a worshipper of Hircine, or else we simply can't do the companion's quest line at all. Instead, how about when we finally discover that the companions are werewolves, we could have the option to go and join the Silver Hand and wipe out the companions? We can visit the Skyrim branch of the Vigils of Stendarr and tell them that the companions are werewolves, so our opportunity to roleplay as a Daedra hater is extremely limited simply because you don't give us the opportunity to actually make choices based on our characters' designs. So why do you even give us the ability to make our own characters in the first place? In games like Witcher 3 and The Last of Us, the player characters will do whatever they want to hell with what the player wants. But at least those games have the excuse of giving us a pre-written character with his own backstory and quirks. Why would you give us the ability to create our own characters at the start of the game, only to take away 99% of the whole reason to make our own characters? So yes, we definitely need more choices and branching storylines in the games. However, with choices comes the next natural evolution in a good RPG: consequences. The way we handle quests needs to have some impact on the world. As I discussed last time, it could be something as simple as an NPC refusing to deal with you if you go against their wishes. But I would also like to see the occasional big consequence for your actions, like completely reshaping the political climate of the province you're in, or perhaps even having an entire city destroyed in the climax of a quest line, depending on how you handle that quest line. Kind of like Kvatch or Helgen, except that it doesn't happen at the beginning of the game, and you actually get a chance to grow attached to this city before it gets destroyed. You might think that this would just harbor resentment and anger at the game. To that I say, yeah, that's the idea. Do you not know the first thing about storytelling? You need to work the audience's emotions. It's the reason why movies, books, and TV shows will often kill off beloved characters. Let me put it this way. Imagine, for a minute, that the happiness a person is feeling can be quantified. Not an NPC stat, but a real-life person can have his happiness represented by a numerical value. If this person is seeing the ending to a movie without seeing the movie first, he sees a happy moment, and so his happiness is set to 10 points. That means that he went from 0 to 10 points from seeing that scene out of context, an increase in 10 points. Now, imagine that this same person actually sees the whole movie. He sees the sad moments, and so his happiness right before the happy ending is now at -10. After seeing the happy ending, his happiness is now at positive 10 again. This time, however, because he was sad immediately before the happy ending, his happiness has now gone up by 20 points rather than just 10. The best storytellers in the world know how to exploit this phenomenon of the human psyche. They know how to strategically put sad moments in just the right places to give their audience the maximum amount of elation possible. So yes, destroying the city would probably harbor some anger and resentment at the game. That is literally the whole point of why you should destroy the city in the first place. Of course, I would want these big consequences, like destroying cities or altering the political landscape of the province, to be few and far between. In fact, I would prefer if this only happened once each. But minor consequences, such as alienating NPCs, should be much more frequent. Nearly every choice we make in the game should have some consequences. Speaking of telling grandiose stories, that leads us to... Let me give you an idea of just how far you dropped the ball with your factions in Skyrim. In regards to the companions, you walk in, and in about a week in-universe, suddenly you are the leader of the faction. I feel like I barely know these people. If they're not even in the circle, then I don't even know their names. I have done a total of 10 jobs for the companions throughout the entire quest line before being named Harbinger. Skyrim saw the return of Radiant quests from Arena and Daggerfall. This could have been a good way for you to pad out the quest lines. You should have to do the dirty work for the faction in order to rise through the ranks. Otherwise, your eventual rise to leadership just feels arbitrary and out of nowhere. So it is best to have this dirty work be procedurally generated, so you can instead focus your attention and man-hours of labor on the quests that actually advance the plot of the faction quest lines. Ideally, I would want about 10 or 12 quests per faction that actually advance the story. In between each of these story advancing quests, I would like it if there were anywhere between 3 and 8 Radiant quests we needed to do to unlock the next story advancing quest. That way, we'll feel like we've truly earned our spot at the top of the food chain. However, when you actually become leader of the faction, that should carry some responsibilities. You should have to actually make some decisions when you become leader of a faction, and these decisions should actually impact the faction in some way. With the companions, your subordinates still hand out your jobs for you. You should be getting your jobs directly from the clients. As Thieves Guild's guildmaster, Brynjol says that being leader is more than getting a cut of the spoils, it's about keeping the rabble in order. However, your experience after becoming guildmaster seems to be limited to getting a cut of the spoils. The only faction that shows any change when you become a leader is the Dark Brotherhood, but even that doesn't have you taking on any leadership responsibilities. Instead, the only change is that you get your contracts directly from the Night Mother rather than Astrid or Nazir. This has to change. Ever since Morrowind, you have made the player the leader of nearly every faction, and then bequeathed the player absolutely no responsibilities befitting your new station. I understand that you don't want the player's responsibilities as faction leader to get in the way of his adventuring and questing. But then again, if that's the case, maybe the lesser of two evils is to simply not make the player the leader of the faction in the first place, just like with marriage and adoption in the previous pre-Skyrim games. Besides, you wouldn't even need to force the player away from adventuring if you do it right. After all, in the real world, business owners will often assign managers to the day-to-day duties of managing a specific restaurant or store, so they can divide their attention between the multiple stores and restaurants they own, giving only a few hours a week to each store or restaurant. You could very easily have the player assign an NPC to manage the day-to-day affairs of a faction after you become the leader, while still giving general guidelines for how the faction should be run. These guidelines could take the form of sliders that could adjust the stats or items in that faction. For example, suppose you become leader of the Fighters Guild. You can adjust a slider to charge customers more money for the guild's services, which would increase the funds in the guild's coffers, but at the cost of losing some customers altogether since they can no longer afford your services. There could also be a slider allowing you to invest more in weapons and armor, which would cause the weapons and armor laying around the guild, as well as the gear equipped by the guild members, to be of higher tier material. But these higher tier weapons and armor would cost more, requiring you to either raise the aforementioned prices or cut back on other costs. A similar slider could adjust the skill requirements for each rank of the guild, which would increase the stats for each NPC of that rank, but then they would expect higher wages to compensate for their higher skills. Once you find the sweet spot for each slider and have optimal, self-sustaining settings for the guild, you could then simply assign a manager to run the day-to-day affairs of the guild, and then just set the guild to autopilot and go on your adventuring way. You can have your cake and eat it too. As for the factions themselves, I would like there to be multiple major factions for each playstyle. At least 2 per playstyle, one morally good and one morally evil. For example, the Penitus Oculatus could serve as a good guy assassin's faction, countering the Dark Brotherhood. Rather than carrying out assassinations on behalf of whoever pays their fee, you can instead carry out assassinations against threats to the Emperor or the established government. I would like to see a foil to the Fighters Guild, sort of like the Blackwood Company in Oblivion, only as an actual joinable faction. Joining one faction should automatically alienate you from joining the opposing faction, unless your membership in that organization is supposed to be secret in-universe, like with the Dark Brotherhood. In the rare event you can join 2 competing factions at once, I would like the option to be a double agent for one of those factions, not unlike the main quest in Fallout 4, where either the Brotherhood of Steel or the Railroad entrusted you to be a double agent inside the Institute. Of course, I would prefer if these factions were not clearly divided into good and evil. I would prefer it to be that each faction had good and bad points to them. For example, there should be at least 2 magic factions you can join, one which is motivated by profit and political favor, the other which is motivated more by arcane knowledge for its own sake. Neither goal is inherently evil or unethical, but while the latter faction's goal would certainly seem more noble and pure, you could write them as being so obsessed with the advancement of arcane knowledge that they see collateral damage and even innocent lives as expendable means to that end. Meanwhile, the political-driven faction would show more regard for the consequences of their actions. This regard for the value of human life may be more driven by fear of legal repercussions than any inherent moral compass, but as the knowledge-driven faction demonstrates, that's still better than nothing. Even factions that have typically been regarded as black and white, pure good or pure evil, can still have some moral ambiguity written into them. For example, the Dark Brotherhood are cutthroats with no scruples, but as Skyrim's assassination targets Grelod the Kind and Elaine Dufont both clearly demonstrate, they're cutthroats with no scruples who the people of Tamriel really need from time to time, as they are often a person's last resort to obtain justice against those who've wronged them, when the legitimate law enforcement channels prove ineffective. I would love to see that side of the Dark Brotherhood explored more in Elder Scrolls 6. While I do love the over-the-top evil Dark Brotherhood from Oblivion, sadly you can't do that every game, otherwise it would get repetitive. Hell, even in Oblivion there is at least some indication that the Dark Brotherhood may do some good in the world, although unlike in Skyrim it was very easy to miss if you weren't careful. Specifically, Rufio, the man you're supposed to kill during your Dark Brotherhood initiation, implies that he believed he was being targeted for assassination because of a previous sexual assault he made on a woman. Meanwhile, the Penitus Oculatus wouldn't just be third echelon type good guys. While they have a goal that appears more noble on paper than that of the Dark Brotherhood, the protection of the Emperor, they are known to go to some pretty extreme lengths to ensure the Emperor's protection. For example, in the Elder Scrolls novel Twin Souls, protagonist Colin Vineben was initiated into the Penitus Oculatus by assassinating an innocent old man. Not because this man had done anything wrong, but just because his boss wanted to make sure that he was able to follow orders without question, no matter what those orders may be. So there is definitely some precedent for the Penitus Oculatus doing some terrible things in furtherance of a facially good goal, and I would love to see that further explored in the Elder Scrolls 6. Other examples of moral ambiguity in your factions could include the Fighters Guild having to protect a local politician or nobleman who is actually corrupt simply because the law is technically on his side. Alternatively, a good guy's assassination faction being asked to go out and kill a person who is acquitted of his crime because the client believes he only got off on a technicality. Although a further investigation into the facts may reveal that the target was most likely innocent. Turns out this technicality he used to secure his acquittal exists for good reason, after all. But you nevertheless have to kill him simply because your boss has invoked his FU clause against his right to due process. There's plenty of opportunities for you to make your factions morally ambiguous. Get creative. That about does it for the major factions, but variety is the spice of life, and I would greatly appreciate having lots of options. This leads me to... In addition to having major factions with big, epic storylines and moral ambiguity, I would also like the ability to join several minor factions. The Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall allowed you to join the clergy of the various divines, as well as the knightly orders of the various kings in High Rock. The knightly orders were like becoming a thing in Skyrim, except that there was an entire faction and series of quests dedicated to being a knight. I would definitely like to see these factions return. The various clergies can be implemented into the new game without any trouble. If Elder Scrolls 6 doesn't take place in High Rock, you can simply reskin the knightly orders as different factions with a different name indigenous to the province in which the game actually takes place. In addition to clergies and knightly orders, I would also like the opportunity to join different bandit clans for role-playing purposes. I would prefer if these minor factions didn't have storylines to them. Quality over quantity. I would prefer if you invested your time and energy into developing the storylines of the major factions. Instead, the minor factions should just have Radiant quests. Joining them should be solely for role-playing purposes. For the clergy factions and the knightly orders, you can easily bring back the Radiant quests from Daggerfall, almost verbatim. For the bandit factions, you could have Radiant quests like attacking a rival bandit clan, defending your camp from a rival attack, or hiding on the side of the highway and waiting for a caravan to come by so you can rob it. You could also have a Radiant quest where you have to kidnap someone to hold them for ransom. You would have to knock them out, not kill them. If you killed them, you failed the quest. See earlier for details about the importance of having quests that can be failed. Sometimes their families would just pay the ransom, other times they may hire the Fighters Guild to try and rescue the victims, and you'd have to fight off the mercenaries, only then would the families pay the ransom. This would, of course, require that you cannot join a bandit clan and the Fighters Guild at the same time. As I said before, publicly being a member of one faction, the keyword being publicly, should prevent you from joining any other factions. But at the end of the day, what I want most out of the Elder Scrolls 6 is a good game. But I don't have to tell you that. Bethesda will almost certainly deliver on that promise. All in all, when I fire up the Elder Scrolls 6 for the first time, I'm going to have a sense of epicness and grand adventure in front of me. I always do with the Elder Scrolls. So Bethesda, I want you to know this. The fans have come to expect greatness from the franchise name, The Elder Scrolls. Do not disappoint us. And so concludes Elder Scrolls 6 month. I hope you all enjoyed my discussions about the ideal Elder Scrolls game. And I hope you all had a good time posting your own ideas in the comments. If you enjoyed this month, then please consider subscribing for more in-depth discussion of your favorite video game franchises. Also check out some of my Let's Plays, where I take a more lighthearted approach to these games and just have a good time. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I close out Elder Scrolls 6 month by saying that I will see you guys later.